Chers collègues, la séance est ouverte. Je rappelle que les personnes...
Dear colleagues, the sitting is open. I'd like to encourage colleagues who want to take the floor to make sure they put their badge in the reader before they take the floor. If you want to take the floor, please ensure that you press on the request button only once. Let's go back to the list of speakers, and I'm going to give the floor now to Mrs. Marina from Ukraine. You have the floor.
Dear Mr. President, dear colleagues, first of all, I would like to thank you, our rapporteurs, for work you've done and highlights the importance of this debate and the work of Parliamentary Assembly in supporting Ukraine that meets support ideas of rule of law and human rights. I want to thank Mr. Davor for his detailed overview of the progress made on the different components of a comprehensive system of accountability for the Russian Federation aggression against Ukraine and its legal and human rights consequences. It is important to emphasize that since February 2014 and every new day, as long as the crime of aggression continues, Russia continues to commit other international crimes against Ukraine and our people, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. This report mentions a significant number of reports of atrocity, violations of human rights, and international humanitarian law committed by Russian military forces on our territory. The scale of the damage is measured in wiped out cities, millions of deported and displaced adults and children, millions who remain in the temporarily occupied territories and are subjected to forced passportization, mobilization, filtration, and forced disappearance, sexual violence, etc. We even talk about culture and environmental issues. And this list of internationally wrongful acts of the aggression state is far from complete. And the real truth, we have yet to discover the real scale of their crimes, and this real truth after the war is over. All our territories are deoccupied and all our people return home. This war of the Russian Federation, according to many estimates, is the first most documented and digitized crime of aggression in history. Can you imagine? There is an urgent need for effective mechanisms to investigate and bring to justice all those responsible, especially the military and political leadership of the Russian Federation. So Ukraine society and the whole world that respects the rule of law have an indisputable demand for justice. We can move one step closer to it by establishing the special tribunal for the crime of aggression of the Russian Federation as an ad hoc institution with the highest international legitimacy, prosecuting Russian offenders on the principle of universal criminal jurisdiction in the member states of the Council of Europe, expanding the circle of states that will join the joint investigation team after the ICC investigation of the crime of genocide on the territory of Ukraine, arresting persons on the basis of warrants issued by the ICC, and recognizing Russia as a state sponsor of terrorism. Thank you very much, dear rapporteurs, for this work, and I hope we all will support not only today's debates, but the report you prepared. Thank you.
Merci, Madame.
Thank you very much indeed. Because we now have more people in the chamber, can I point out that what we have planned is to interrupt the list of speakers at 4:45 approximately, so that we can hear the reply from the committee and that we can then move along to 5:20, because I'm sure, as you remember, we're waiting for the Olympic torch. Let me now give the floor to Larry Brock from Canada.
Monsieur le Président, mes chers collègues.
Thank you, Mr. President and colleagues.
February, Canada and Ukraine signed a significant new agreement on security cooperation. I bring it up today because an entire section of it deals with accountability. And that's a common thread running through all three of the reports that we're debating. More specifically, our security agreement with Ukraine states that we'll continue to engage in the core group to examine options for establishing a special tribunal on the crime of aggression against Ukraine. Rapporteur Steer's report makes a clear proposal in that respect, the creation of a tribunal through an agreement between Ukraine and the Council of Europe. This, the report argues, is the most feasible option in terms of legal basis and political legitimacy, because it would clearly fall within the mandate of the Council of Europe, and it would ensure justice for a crime that was and is still being committed against one of its member states by a former member state. I'm not in a position to say whether this is indeed the most feasible option, but the report does make a compelling case for it. And I agree that the core group needs to decide on the model and legal form of the tribunal as soon as possible. In my remaining time today, I'd like to briefly recognize the important work of Rapporteur Kravchuk on Russia's use of cultural cleansing as a weapon of war in Ukraine. This issue is also covered in our bilateral security agreement, which acknowledges that Russia's war on Ukraine has sought to destroy the Ukrainian identity and silence Ukrainian voices. The agreement commits Canada to, amongst other things, helping Ukraine across audiences in its temporarily occupied territories and supporting and promoting Ukrainian voices internationally. With the Ukrainian-Canadian community of some 1.3 million people, we're well aware in Canada of Ukraine's unique, distinct, and incredible culture. And will continue doing all we can to help Ukraine defend and promote it. Slava Ukraini!
Merci.
Thank you very much indeed. Let me now give the floor to Mrs. Maria Mentseva from Ukraine.
Elle ne semble pas être là.
I don't think she's here in the chamber. Can I suggest we give the floor to the next speaker? That's Olena Moshinets from Ukraine. You have the floor, madam.
I would like to thank all the speakers for addressing the issue of Russian aggression in a multi-faced way, from legal issues to the destruction of culture. By its action, Russia is destroying the international order and peace built by the joint efforts of millions. The Geneva Convention states that prisoners of war should be treated humanly. Russia says, Olenivka, when Ukrainian prisoners died in Russian captivity. Violations of the conventions are evidenced by mutilated bodies of Ukrainian prisoners of war who return home after months and years of Russian captivity. The Geneva Convention refers to the proper treatment of civilians in the occupied territories, while Russia's actions are murder, torture, violence, genocide. The effective medicine for genocide is timely military assistance and serious damage to the economy of the aggressor state. The use of Russian assets to support Ukraine is a fair solution. We are grateful to the countries that support the recovery of frozen Russian assets for the benefit of Ukraine and call on others to join the creation of an international compensation mechanism. Equally important are the sanctions that are actually effective. Despite the statements of the Russian leadership, their so-called economic growth is driven by an increase in the military-industrial complex. However, we have no moral right to ease the sanctions pressure on the aggressor. First of all, we need to develop mechanisms that would block the Russian bypass roads as much as possible, in particular through Central Asian countries. We are grateful to the representatives of EU countries for the adoption of the 14th sanctions package aimed at strengthening the impact of sanctions by eliminating loopholes. That shows that it will not be possible to get away with destroying Ukraine, the Ukrainian nation, and its identity. The Russian Federation killed everything Ukrainian. According to the component ministry, as of February of this year, almost 2,000 cultural sites in Ukraine have been damaged. Schools in occupation are not a happy and carefree childhood. They fear misunderstanding of a new program and coercion. The National Resistance Center reports on a new position in schools in the temporarily occupied territories, the so-called patriotism supervisors. And children who have returned to Ukraine tell of a new order in schools, disciplinary talks for using the Ukrainian language and being forced to walk around wrapped in a Russian flag. This school terror and imposition of Russian ideology to destroy Ukrainian identity and culture has been going on for 10 years. Please, we hope for the support of the world and Europe. Thank you.
Merci, Madame.
Thank you very much indeed. Now, we need to interrupt the list of speakers. Speakers that have been signed up for the debate have not been able to take the floor can send their speech in the next 4 hours, their typed speech to the table office for publication in the minutes. This should not be more than 400 words in length. It needs to be sent by email. Let me now call on the committees for a reply. Let me give, first of all, the floor to the rapporteur, Mr. Steer. You have 3 minutes to reply to the points made.
Thank you, Chair, and dear colleagues, thank you very much for all your interventions, your comments, your questions. Let me also thank our Secretariat, Mr. Schirmer, and in particular Mr. Guillem Cano Palomares for their great contribution and assistance in this report. Now, about your questions and your comments, some of them have already been incorporated in the text, namely, for example, the new ICC indictments for former Defense Minister Shoigu and General Gerasimov. Dear colleagues, this assembly was the first assembly to vote to expel the Russian Federation after the invasion of Ukraine. This assembly was the first one to call for the creation of a special tribunal for the war, for the crime of aggression. Now we are very close to reach an agreement at the core group in the meeting the following days in Bucharest. One of the issues that is still impeding that is the question how to deal with the personal immunities. We state in this report clearly that these personal immunities should not apply for the key suspects for the crime of aggression. But we also provide language that we hope will help to find the agreement and to finally have a special tribunal. We also provide the legal arguments for declaring Russia a state sponsoring terrorism. And we also provide the legal arguments and the framework for a full-fledged compensation mechanism. Now, dear colleagues, many of you mentioned not only what this Assembly is doing, not only what the Council of Europe is doing, but also what the European Union and the European Parliament in particular has done or is about to do about these issues. And I take all these recommendations with me. As you know, this will be my last report here, and after 7 rewarding years in this Assembly, I will be moving to the European Parliament. I will take all your suggestions with me, but also the important mission of promoting democracy, human rights, and the rule of law to that institution across the passerelle. I think that there is no better issue than to defend democracy today by defending the right of the Ukrainians to be free. And I invite you all to support not only this report, but all the 3 reports today to support Ukraine, to support freedom. Thank you.
Merci, Monsieur Steer.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Steer, and all the very best in your future activities in Brussels and sometimes in Strasbourg, of course. Let me now give the floor to the chairperson of the Committee on Legal Affairs and Human Rights, Lord Keane. You have 3 minutes.
Thank you, President. Thank you, colleagues. I would like to express my unqualified support for the three rapporteurs and the significant reports that they've placed before this Assembly. And I would also like to thank all colleagues for their contributions during the course of this debate. Davos Deer's report addresses a number of critical issues, including, first of all, the establishment of an international compensation mechanism for all of the destruction caused by the Russian aggression to both the Ukrainian state and individual victims. Second, it highlights the need to ensure that there is a comprehensive and effective tribunal to deal with all of the violations of international law, international criminal law, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and indeed instances of genocide that have been the result of the Russian aggression. I had the privilege to attend a meeting of CADI in April when progress was made on establishing a bilateral agreement between Ukraine and the Council of Europe for the establishment of what would be recognized as an international tribunal. Ms. Kravchuk held up to this Assembly that most disturbing of symbols, a burnt book. Colleagues, when books burn, you know that the barbarians are at the gate. Russia is seeking to deliberately impose a dystopian future upon a Ukrainian society that they would leave bereft of any cultural identity. Her report is a timely reminder of the dark shadow that Russia would extend over a free Europe and over a democratic Europe. Can I turn then to the report from Ms. Jasko, which deals with two elements of sanctions: sanctions on export and sanctions on import. And dealing with the former, even today, oil and gas leaves Russia in record quantities. We've all heard of money laundering, but what we're facing at the moment is sanctions laundering. Oil moves in a shadow fleet to third-party countries where it's refined, and the refined products are then imported by countries that claim they are sanctioning Russian oil. We can do more. On the matter of imports, despite an international sanctions regime, Russia continues to access raw materials and critical components from abroad. And this has allowed for the continued production of core weapons and an increase in the sophistication of key military capabilities. Why have we failed to disrupt that industrial level of importation? We've been slow to address indirect routes for material into Russia. We've become reactive rather than proactive in dealing with Russia's procurement networks. And we're not doing enough to coordinate the work of trade bodies throughout Europe and the world. Indeed, we must also be prepared to adopt covert as well as overt methods in order to deal with this. I reiterate that I welcome all three reports, which are both timely and well considered, and I thank colleagues for their attention.
Merci, Lord Keane.
Thank you very much indeed, Lord Keane. I'd like to give the floor to Ms. Jasko, our rapporteur. You have 3 minutes.
Thank this House, this Assembly, for the majority of your voices supporting an importance of sanctions, which means that majority of you are on the light and positive, right part of the morality. Yes, we are all in politics, and some may say that in politics you're not making, moral right decisions. I'm sorry. No, it's not the case anymore. Business as usual shouldn't be going the way it was going for many years. because business as usual always leads to feeding those who can commit crimes and run aggression. To those who still have doubts, why shall we impose sanctions? I want to answer. Sanctions is not about the quantity, it's about quality. We're not running for a number of sanctions. We're running for those sanctions that would restrict Russian aggression. We want to make sure that those who are producing weapons inside Russia are sanctioned. We want to be sure that those who open their TV channels, telecommunication systems for Russian propagandists that are sanctioned. We want to make sure that the Danish port trains are not easily operating for Russian shadow fleet, where they're committing environmental damages. This assembly should be based on the moral human rights decisions. That's why I want to congratulate us for also talking about very practical things on how can we make sure that we have a tracking system for the sanction circumventions. And I'm very grateful for those of you who raised different discussions on how can we make sure that European institutions will cooperate on making sure that these financial flows that may lead to sanction circumventions are accountable. We need to make sure that banks, the customs, and the exchange of all this information is working. So I'm very grateful if, for instance, our colleague Davor in European Parliament will be also raising this. We need to be united in different European institutions. I really hope that this report will also have serious follow-ups that will be not in the forms of the report, but in the forms of real actions, where we can make sure that we put more people, more companies on the right side of the history. I believe that it's a time to think about your own reputation. Don't sell goods to Russia, because these goods may end up in killing people. Don't be involved in that. Please stop selling goods to Russia, and let us all make all possible to restrict Russian aggression against Ukraine or in any other places. Thank you.
Merci, Madame.
Thank you very much indeed. Let me now give the floor to Mr. Tsingaris, who's a Vice Chairperson of the Committee on Political Affairs and Democracy. You have 3 minutes, Mr. Tsingaris.
Dear colleagues and friends, I spent more like 30 years in this assembly, and now during 75th year, we just facing our unique phase that we are together and we are voting in favor for mostly all the resolutions. So in front of us, we are 3 rapporteurs. Madame Kravchuk report is about annihilation, totally annihilation and political will to annihilate Ukrainian culture. Davor Stier report, how he called in 2 words, I would like to cite my friend, it's intentionally preparing the genocide who should be evaluated by our international court, who will be created. But intentionally prepared genocide, just was said by our fantastic rapporteur, Davor Stier. And first and last one, Madam Yesko, about cynical face of our society when part of our firms avoiding circumvening the sanctions and making rich, and for those money it will be used for destabilization of Europe. And those firms will become Russian political agents. So the different restrictive measures adopted by several of our member states against the Russian Federation serve the dual purpose of undermining Russia's ability to finance the brutal war of aggression that is waging against Ukraine, thus limiting the impact of its actions, as well as sending a strong political signal to the Russian elites as well as to other autocratic regimes that they will be held accountable for their international illegal criminal acts. The Assembly has already pronounced its position on the sanctions regime against Russian Federation. It is, however, our duty to keep focusing on this matter. We must be all vocal and call our governments to take stronger measures, dear friends, and close all legal loopholes that still allow Russia to avoid and circumvent sanctions. At the same time, keep the public attention alive on the vital importance of the sanctions, not only for Ukraine, but for security, not supporting Ukraine, but for the security in all Europe. On behalf of the committee, I welcome the various important recommendations that are contained in the draft resolution of all three reports, but especially want to thank Madame Yasko for her commitment in preparing it, and of course all staff from our committee and from a neighboring Legal Affairs Committee. Madame Yasko organized a side event during January per session that was very useful, and she held meetings with German representatives. The committee has supported her work through the way organizing 2 hearings with different experts. I would like to say that amendment with register to be established, register for the firms who are avoiding the sanctions, was voted like amendment, and all amendments in our committee was voted unanimously. That's historic case that no one abstained, no one doubt about Madame Yasko report. Thank you so much for being unanimously on the side of the true and historical evaluation of this terrible tragedy. Tragedy should be stopped. Thank you.
Merci, Monsieur.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Tsingaris. Let me now give the floor to Ms. Kravchuk, our rapporteur. You have 3 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, friends and colleagues. Thank you, rapporteurs. I think all these 3 reports bring us closer to justice. And that's what the members of Assembly, of course, should do, bring justice closer. I listened carefully to your speeches when you spoke about culture, about your culture, national cultures, identities, languages. And I really understand that if Ukraine would not stop Russia, they would come to your countries and to erase your identity, as they actually do for indigenous people in Russian Federation. And I thank for the amendment to be put to the report, because it's important. No one talks about it. So we should talk about the erasure of identities of indigenous people in Russian Federation. In Belarus, there is Russification, because this Ruski Mir, Russian world, wants to eliminate everything that is different. I would like to thank all of the experts who helped me with this report. I would like to thank the Secretariat, who did a tremendous job. I would like to thank the Prosecutor General of Ukraine, Andriy Kostin, who is now prosecuting crimes against cultural heritage. And I would like to actually stop on a positive note, because on July 5th, in National Museum of History in Ukraine, there will be an exhibition launched. It's called Treasures of Crimea, The Return. These are Scythian gold, priceless objects. They were exhibited in Amsterdam during the annexation of Crimea, and these are objects of 4 Crimean museums. After years of courts, they returned to Ukraine, they returned to Kyiv in November 2023. And this exhibition will be permanent. By the time we liberate Crimea and take Scythian gold to Crimean museums that are in occupation right now, and I want to see this day, to invite all of you to go to Crimea, to see these objects. And by the way, I would like to congratulate Crimean Tatars on the National Flag Day of Crimean Tatars. Thank you, friends. Slava Ukraini!
Merci, Madame.
Thank you very much. I now call Mrs. Helleland, President of the Committee on Culture, Science, Education and the Media. You have the floor, Madam.
Dear colleagues, thank you to our rapporteurs for their excellent reports and for the contribution from you, dear colleagues. The right to take part in cultural life and to enjoy both tangible and intangible cultural heritage are pivotal to the system of human rights and fundamental to individual and collective cultural identity. However, the international legal framework concerning cultural heritage in armed conflicts remains fragmented. It has significant gaps, particularly in relation to new types of warfare and to the safeguarding of cultural heritage after conflicts. The return of cultural heritage and restoration of damaged heritage objects are also matters of concern. Loopholes in international law make it difficult to bring perpetrators to justice before international or national courts. In the draft recommendation, we therefore call on the Committee of Ministers to start a cooperation with the United Nations, the European Union, and other relevant organizations. This in order to develop legal and policy responses to new forms of cultural erasure, taking into account existing Council of Europe conventions and other international treaties. We propose that acts of cultural cleansing or erasure, deliberate or systematic destruction or cultural heritage and losing of cultural property are legally defined as human rights violation, crimes against humanity and war crimes for the purpose of their prosecution. It is also necessary to legally determine the role that a state-driven policy of cultural erasure has as one of the inherent elements of the intent to destroy a national or any other protected group when committing genocide. We call on our member states to continue providing support to Ukraine and in particular to gather, record, document and preserve evidence of crimes committed by the Russian Federation against cultural heritage in Ukraine in order to assess damages and seek reparations. To digitalize objects of cultural heritage and property, to build institutional capacity to ensure the best use of funding provided by outside agencies and donors, to enhance heritage management and carry out reconstruction processes, to develop specific projects for cultural heritage, support for cultural vitality and cultural exchange and funding initiatives, grants and residency programs. On behalf of the Culture Committee, I invite you to back the proposals that are outlined in the draft resolution and draft recommendation with your vote today and in your Parliament tomorrow. We thank you for your support.
Merci, Madame.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Helleland.
Nous en venons donc.
That brings us on to the first report on legal and human rights aspects of the Russian Federation's aggression against Ukraine. The Committee on Legal Affairs and Human Rights has presented a draft resolution to which 4 amendments have been tabled and a draft recommendation to which no amendment was tabled. The amendments will be taken in the order as they appear in the compendium of amendments. Dear colleagues, I would like to remind you that speaking time is limited to 30 seconds for each amendment. I've been told by the Chair of the Committee on Legal Affairs and Human Rights that the committee would like to request that amendments 3 and 4, which were adopted unanimously by the committee, should be deemed as adopted by the Assembly. Is that correct, Chair?
Merci.
Thank you very much. If there are no objections, then we will deem those amendments as approved definitively. If, however, there is an objection, we need to verify whether 10 members support the objection. Is there an objection in the chamber? Apparently not. No objections. Amendments 3 and 4 on the draft resolution have thus been adopted definitively. Thank you. In addition, I have been told by the Chair of the Committee on Legal Affairs and Human Rights that amendment number 1 was rejected by the committee with a 2/3 of majority of votes cast. Is that correct, Chair?
Merci. Si personne...
Thank you very much. If there are no objections, I will declare that amendment as rejected definitively. If, however, there is an objection, we need to verify whether 10 members support the objection. Is there an objection in the chamber? Apparently not. No objections, which means that amendment number 1 to the draft resolution is rejected and will not be called to the vote. We move on then to the discussion of the other amendments. Amendment number 2. I call Mrs. Maria Mezentseva in support of amendment number 2. You have 30 seconds, madam.
Vous pouvez rester assise.
You may stay seated if you prefer.
Dear President, thank you, dear President. Apparently, we have here a misspelling of the word, and we consulted with the table office. So we are referring to our colleagues from OSCE and NATO Parliamentary Assembly, where we call the Russian ideology as Russism, and it was a misspelling racism. So we suggest that we call the Russian Federation state ideology, in the brackets, Russism. And it was also communicated to the rapporteur.
Merci,
Thank you very much, madam. Would anybody like to speak against this amendment?
Je ne vois personne.
I see no member requesting the floor. The opinion of the committee, please.
We are content. If there is,
didn't consider. It was no position because it was not moved at the...
I'm sorry, it was not moved at committee, I'm reminded.
OK. L'amendement n'a pas été...
Very well. The amendment was not moved in committee, and therefore we shall put it to the vote. The vote is open.
Oui. C'est très bien avec la flamme, il y a beaucoup.
Wonderful. With the torch, there are a lot of people in the chamber today.
Voilà, je propose.
Very well. I suggest we now close the vote and I call for the results to be displayed. The amendment is carried.
Nous allons...
And we're now going to vote on the draft resolution. You'll find it in document 15998. The vote is open. A simple majority is what is required here. The vote is open.
Le scrutin est clos. Je demande
The vote is closed and I call for the result to be displayed.
à la majorité absolue.
Absolute majority in favour. Thank you very much. The draft resolution is thus adopted. Thank you. We now move on to the draft recommendation. We here require a 2/3 majority. The reference document is 15998. No amendments were tabled to this report. The vote is now open.
Le scrutin est clos. Je demande l'affichage.
The vote is closed and I call for the result to be displayed. It's the same result. It's a unanimous approval. Congratulations. The draft recommendation is thus adopted by the House and I commend the author.
Je vous propose.
Ladies and gentlemen, I suggest we move on now to the second report, the role of sanctions in countering the Russian Federation's war of aggression against Ukraine. The reference document is 16000. The Committee on Political Affairs and Democracy has presented a draft resolution. 13 amendments were tabled to it. The amendments will be taken in the order as they appear in the compendium of amendments. Colleagues, I would remind you once again that speaking time is limited to 30 seconds per amendment. I've been told that the Vice Chair of the Committee on Political Affairs and Democracy would like to ask that amendments 1 to 13, which were unanimously approved by committee, that they also be deemed to be adopted by the Assembly. Is that correct, Vice Chair?
Adopted. Thank you.
Merci, Monsieur le Vice-président.
Thank you very much to the Vice Chair. So that is unanimous, and that is, you're suggesting, therefore, that the Assembly adopt these definitively, unless there are objections, of course. If there are any objections, then we need to verify whether 10 members support the objection. Are there any objections? Apparently not. Thank you. So amendments 1 to 13 to the draft resolution are thus carried by the House. Thank you.
Nous allons donc.
Which means that we can now put to the vote the draft resolution. Document 16000. We require a simple majority for this. The vote is open.
Le scrutin est clos.
And the vote is closed. I call for the result to be displayed. Almost unanimous, which means that the draft is approved by the House. Thank you.
Troisième rapport.
We move on to the third report, countering the erasure of cultural identity in war and peace. Document 16003. The Committee on Culture, Science, Education and Media has presented a draft resolution. 2 amendments have been tabled to this draft resolution. There's also a draft recommendation to which no amendments were tabled. The amendments will be called in the order as they appear in the compendium of amendments. My dear colleagues, might I remind you that the speaking time for each amendment is restricted to 30 seconds. I've been informed by the Chair of the Committee on Culture, Science, Education and Media that amendment number 2 was approved unanimously in committee and amendment 1 was rejected by a 2/3 majority in committee in terms of the number of votes cast. However, the examination of these 2 amendments is connected and therefore we shall follow the normal procedure. Amendment number 1 and the sub-amendment, which were rejected, like I said, by a 2/3 majority in committee. I call Mrs. Mizentseva to support amendment number 1, please.
Merci, le Président. Thank you, dear President. I will have to withdraw Amendment 1, but because I didn't have an opportunity to speak, I will use 23 seconds to remind us all that today we have International Day of Combating Tortures. And I want to say thank you to everyone who mentioned prisoners of war in Ukraine, civilians who are in prisons, and deported children of Ukraine. We all wait for them to be back. Thank you very much, and I withdraw amendment number 1.
Merci.
Thank you very much. So the amendment is withdrawn. Thank you. Which means that we can move on to amendment number 2. And I call Mrs. Mizentseva to support amendment number 2.
Merci, Monsieur Président. We have a very simple philosophy here, dear friends. We're talking widely in the topic of targeting cultural identity, Eurasian identity. By this amendment, we enhance the understanding that Russian Federation, so-called Federation, has numerous indigenous people living there who are deprived for their native language, culture, history, and many other identity items as ethnic minorities. Thank you.
Merci. Est-ce que quelqu'un demande...
Thank you very much. Would anybody wish to speak against this amendment? I call the committee. According to my information, this was adopted unanimously in committee. Is that right, Chair?
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you. Let us move on then to the vote. And the vote is open.
Le scrutin est clos. Je demande...
The vote is closed. I call for the result to be displayed. It is unanimously approved.
Nous allons...
I haven't quite finished. We're going to move on to the draft resolution now. We require a simple majority for this one. Document 16003, and the vote is open.
La flamme fait venir de plus en plus de...
I see that there are more and more voters coming in as the Olympic torch approaches. That's a very good thing. The vote is closed, and I ask for the result to be displayed. It is carried unanimously. Congratulations. 16003 is thus adopted. Congratulations.
Nous passons maintenant au vote sur le projet de recommandation.
We move on then to the draft recommendation. Reference document 16003. No amendments were tabled to this. And I would remind you that we need a 2/3 majority of votes cast for this to pass. The vote is open.
Le scrutin est clos.
The vote is closed. And I ask for the result to be displayed. Unanimously approved once again. Congratulations. So draft 16003 is thus approved. Thank you.
Nous allons maintenant...
Ladies and gentlemen, I suggest we move on, waiting for the Olympic torch to arrive, that we move on to our debate on reparation and reconciliation processes to overcome past conflicts and build a common peaceful future, and the question of just and equal redress. So, in accordance with our order of business, we shall hear the presentation of the report tabled by Lord Richard Keane on behalf of the Committee on Legal Affairs and Human Rights. The report is entitled Reparation and Reconciliation Processes to Overcome Past Conflicts and Build a Common Peaceful Future, the question of a just and equal redress. Document 159333. Mr. George Loukaitis will then present the opinion of the Committee on Political Affairs and Democracy, and we should finish our examination of this text by 1900 hours, 7 p.m., including the vote, which means that I'll have to interrupt the list of speakers a quarter of an hour before then. I call Lord Richard Keane, Rapporteur on behalf of the Committee on Legal Affairs and Human Rights. And Rapporteur, might I remind you that you have a speaking time of 7 minutes for the presentation of your report and then 3 minutes at the end of the debate to answer comments made in the chamber. So we'll just wait a moment while people change places, and then I will look forward to hearing your address. Mr. Keane.
On attend encore 30 secondes.
Let us wait another half a minute and then I'll ask you to start, Lord Keane.
Okay. We will begin with Lord Keane, Rapporteur. You have 7 minutes now and 3 minutes to reply to the debate. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, President. Thank you, colleagues. The Council of Europe has a clear role to play in improving reconciliation processes amongst its members. And this is especially true in times of conflict and when there is a climate of growing threats to the rules-based international order, particularly in the wake of the Russian war of aggression against Ukraine. This makes it ever more important for the Council of Europe to promote tools aimed at the peaceful resolution of disputes. The report before you intends to do just this, to call for an enhanced role for the Council of Europe through the establishment of a mediation process. Such a process should be accompanied by an improved toolkit and generally accepted standards for reparation and reconciliation. And the aim must be to find remedies best suited to each individual situation that arises. One size fits all does not work. Such a step could help to ensure a durable peace for the future and respond to the needs of victims. An approach based on mediation should complement existing mechanisms, such as the European Court of Human Rights. Judgments in interstate cases before the court are, as we know, notoriously difficult to implement. Some of these problems could be avoided by a mediation process that would clarify and possibly resolve some issues before an application is lodged. We are proposing a toolkit that would be holistic and victim-centred. Our Assembly is not equipped to build such an instrument itself, that I concede. It will be up to the Committee of Ministers to set the process in motion and invite the specialised services of the Secretariat to develop and evaluate specific proposals. An important recommendation of ours is that the future reconciliation and mediation mechanism should be given some teeth. It is, after all, a requirement under the Council of Europe statute that all member states shall cooperate with one another in good faith in the pursuit of peace based upon justice and international cooperation. And indeed, Article 3 of our statute states, and I quote, "Every member of the Council of Europe must accept the principles of the rule of law and of the enjoyment by all persons within its jurisdiction of human rights and fundamental freedoms, and collaborate sincerely and effectively in the realization of the aim of the Council as specified in Chapter 1. And Article 8 of the statute lays down the possible consequences of a violation of the obligations flowing from Article 3. Colleagues, I am fully aware that any such tool, especially if it is given some teeth, as we recommend, cannot be applied retroactively and certainly should not cover any conflicts before the creation of the Council of Europe, or indeed that lie outside its geographic remit. I excluded those from the scope of my report from the outset. It is also perfectly clear that any mediation process depends on the goodwill and cooperation of all sides. But why not make use of the fact that all member states of the Council of Europe, under the statute, are duty-bound to cooperate with one another, and I quote, sincerely and effectively, for the realization of the ideals defended by our organization. The pursuit of peace based upon justice and international cooperation would be well served by the establishment of the mechanism set out in the report. Colleagues, I thank you for your attention, and I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you, Lord Keane. I call now Mr. Loukaides, Rapporteur for Opinion, Committee on Political Affairs and Democracy. You have 3 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairperson. Dear colleagues, the Committee of Political Affairs and Democracy entrusted me with this opinion that we discussed yesterday and unanimously adopted together with a number of amendments. I wish to congratulate the Rapporteur of the Legal Affairs and Human Rights Committee, Lord Keane, for this important and innovative report, which gives practical significance to the obligation taken up in Reykjavik last year to give our Assembly and this organization a more robust, visible and active role in addressing conflict situations in Europe. The report proposes the establishment of a Council of Europe mediation process to overcome past and frozen conflicts and suggests a number of ways and the conditions under which this mediation process between the parties could be initiated. We fully share the Rapporteur's view that the Council of Europe may play an increased role in promoting solutions to foster justice, cooperation and peace in Europe, thus fulfilling its statutory goal. Accordingly, we welcome the idea of considering establishing a mediation mechanism under the auspices of the Council of Europe to complete the existing tools at the disposal of the organization to facilitate finding solutions to post-conflict disputes. However, the Political Affairs Committee have some reservations with regards to specific parameters proposed by the Legal Affairs Committee report. The most important parameter is the mandatory character of this mediation procedure or mechanism. As Political Affairs Committee, we believe that the mediation process should only be initiated with the full consent and adherence of both parties involved. Any attempts to impose a mediation process in the absence of such consent and adherence may lead to the results opposite to those sought. As the report rightly states, the reparation and reconciliation process in post-conflict situation can be a highly sensitive matter. One must avoid any risk that instead of helping promote reconciliation, attempts to impose mediation lead to new tensions. Furthermore, It is important to state that this new mediation mechanism must not replace nor sidetrack any existing mediation efforts underway, most notably under the framework of the United Nations. It is also important to preserve the right of state parties to lodge interstate applications before the European Court of Human Rights, nor hinder the timing or procedure foreseen in such cases. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Thank you. Now I give the floor to the speakers on behalf of political groups. In the debate, I call first Mr. Goncharenko on behalf of ECDA.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Dear friends, now it's a very symbolical moment. So many viewers, so many of us here. Why? Because Olympic flame is on the way here, and we will speak now here, and we will watch the Olympic flame. But what is Olympic Games? It's the symbol of peace. And we are now speaking about reconciliation process and peace in future. That is very important. But I want to remind all of you that when we will watch with you Olympic flame, the war continues in Europe. And Russia continues to kill Ukrainian people right now. When the whole world is preparing for Olympic Games, unfortunately, we in Ukraine are preparing to give the last honor to our heroes. We are preparing to say the last goodbye to our closest people because Russia is continuing to kill us. And we're speaking about reconciliation. And you know, today is very symbolical. It was in last debates, there was a brilliant speech of Mr. Axel Schäfer from Germany, who stood up and said, Hitler is our shame. What he did in 1939, now Putin is doing in Europe against Ukrainians. That was said by German MP in Strasbourg, which became a symbol of First and the Second World War. And that is the way to peace and reconciliation. So the day when Russian representative will stand up in this assembly or in any other way and will say, Putin and Russian Empire and Russian regime during his time and what Russian people did at that time is the biggest shame of us. That will be the day of reconciliation. When Russia will go through de-imperialization like Germany did, and now Germany is a fantastic country which is ready to build a better future for all the world and not a threat to everybody like it was before the end of the Second World War. But unfortunately, we have this empire still in Europe. And this is the last colonial empire in Europe, which is called Russian Empire, and it's still active, and it still attacks and is killing. And the many peoples, including my nation, Ukrainians, and also Russians themselves are suffering from this empire. So the only way to reconciliation and peace is de-imperialization. And when in this assembly there will be free Chechen Republic, free Tatarstan, free Buryatia, free Cherkessia, and other free republics in Dagestan, and will be together with us, that will be the day when finally Europe will have security, and when the Olympic flame will enter this hall once again. I believe it will happen. I hope not in 75 years, but earlier. And we will know this is the time of peace on our continent, and we will all benefit from this. But before this moment, please don't forget, the war is very close, and we need to stop this evil now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Goncharenko. Now I give the floor to the speaker on behalf of the ALDE group. The floor is yours, Mrs. Kudic, for 3 minutes.
Thank you. Dear colleagues, sometimes bold calls can remain, unfortunately, only that. Bold calls, and if we are going to be entirely cynical, they can even be self-serving speeches expressing good intentions, but without necessarily paving a way forward. Fortunately, this report is not such a report. It is bold, it is innovative, it is brave. My liberal colleagues and myself are delighted every time this institution is called to show greater ambition, to show greater strength, and to show greater vision. And this is such a report. Not only does this report pave the path, but it also justly and in a measured way recognizes both legal and political obstacles, potential obstacles to this initiative. At the same time, it pays close attention to the existing potentials of this institution, namely our assembly, but also, of course, the European Court of Human Rights. And it pays attention to the most important aspects of reparations and reconciliation, that these measures need to be achievable, enforceable, and implementable. At the same time, I want to draw attention to something which I personally and also my colleagues believe to be incredibly important. When we say that these initiatives for reparations and for reconciliation need to be victim-centric, I fully agree. However, what we sometimes fail to realize that actually recognition, reparations, reconciliation initiatives based on mediation can also be incredibly liberating for perpetrators and the states that are responsible for most terrible acts. I come from a country that even today, 30 years later, suffers from genocide deniers from within our own country, but also neighboring countries. I deeply believe that the day will come when, as it will be comforting and important for victims to be seen, to be recognized, both domestically, regionally, and internationally, it will be an enormous opportunity for the perpetrators to face themselves, to offer recognition, and to liberate themselves from these kinds of, from the heritage of war crimes such as genocide. So this is why we need a bold ambition, we need a just ambition, and we need to recognize that we ourselves have the capacity to contribute to the historic potential of these initiatives to engage in mediation with the aim of reparations and reconciliation. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Kudic. Now I give the floor on behalf of the group UEL to Mr. Öztürk. You have 3 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I would like to thank the reporters for this report. While we can only welcome the focus on mediation between Council members and avoidance of conflict, we must register our concerns that without a much more detailed examination of possibilities and possible consequences, as well as the resources and capabilities of this organization, it is difficult to agree detailed prescriptions. The creation of a robust mediation process would seem to be giving the Council a massive new role at a time when existing mechanisms are hardly working. Simple decisions at the European Court of Human Rights take years, and consequences of ignoring those decisions seem minimal, with action continually postponed. However, if these ideas are to be taken further, we endorse the concerns raised by the Committee on Political Affairs and supported unanimously by that committee. We are concerned that making mediation mandatory could make it not only ineffective, but introduce new sources of conflict. We are concerned to see such a prescriptive and detailed proposal at this stage. We are concerned that the introduction of an additional mechanism of conflict resolution could be used to undermine existing mechanisms, slowing the process and enabling states to cherry-pick the mechanism that they feel might treat the most favorably. Thank you very much.
Luis Martinez-Sello, you're next.
The majority of European countries have built a past on pasts of conflict. Our continent is characterized by a past which is characterized by wars, but also by the search for peace to guarantee compliance with human rights and the search for a future of peaceful coexistence. Our identities, our history, and our remembrance of the past are built on conflicts between peoples, between states, and between nations. And the cruelty of the 20th century, and which saw 2 world wars and totalitarian regimes and other terrible events, are our past, but never again should they be our future. And we're witnessing a territorial war again, a war based on the same spirit which was behind other wars. And it has consequences for our continent. This is one aspect of autocracy. And this can end this war sometime, but it doesn't mean it'll end properly or that the wounds will heal and that we can properly say it's over. To have reconciliation, there needs to be reparation. That's behind reparation and mediation. What I would also add, there's a third basic element in which we support both of this. That is knowledge and recognition of reality, knowledge of the reality of the facts in history. This is crucial for the youngest generations, which already barely have access to this dark history. It's crucial for those who every day live with fear and have learned to be silent out of fear. And it's relief for the descendants of the victims who have a right to know what actually happened, why they lost their loved ones. Above all, we need to push for the right measures, prevent to ensure that the darkest history never be repeated. We need to learn from our errors, from the crimes committed against peoples, against individuals, and against their rights. And we need to recognize the reality of history and to do away with symbols of oppression and dictatorship. We need to know the names of victims. We need to give back dignity to their lives and their deaths and to acknowledge their contribution. We need to think about reconciliation and the crimes that we've done, the dimensions of those crimes, and assure we never whitewash what happened. Wars leave victims in all sides, but crimes against human rights and reprisals and deprivation of rights must be acknowledged, and we must learn from this. Spain suffered a coup, a civil war, and a dictatorship for some 40 years. Today, 46 years having become a democracy, we have a law on memory which promotes reconciliation. And in Castile, Aragon, and other parts of Spain, however, they want to whiten this and compare a democratic regime with oppression suffered by more than 150,000 people. And there are still some 30,000 people unknown in common pits. We need to think about this and remember what happened under dictatorship. There are still many families of the victims who are still trying to find reparation. Their loved ones, they should be buried with dignity. And people want to know who were their torturers. We need to know these things. So they need to know their own past. Reparation deals with this. We need to have reparation and reconciliation. Thank you.
Thank you, Luz. Dear colleagues, we will now interrupt for less than 10 minutes following the ceremony of welcoming the Olympic flame in our hemicycle. Madam Secretary General of the Council of Europe, dear Maria. Madam Secretary General of the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, dear Despina. Madam and Mayor of Strasbourg. Madam President of the Strasbourg Eurometropole. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, we will now witness a historic moment the arrival of the Olympic flame in our hemicycle for the first time in the history of the Council of Europe. Let us travel back in time at the heart of antiquity in 776 before Christ in ancient Olympia, when the first Olympic Games were held. A celebration of sportsmanship, unity, and peace. These games were part of a religious festival honoring Zeus, the king of the Greek gods. They were held every 4 years, a period known as Olympiad. Ancient Olympic Games laid the foundation for what would millennia later become the modern Olympic Games, revived in 1896 in Athens by the French Baron Pierre de Coubertin. The Olympic flame has its origin in ancient Greece as well. A sacred fire was kept burning throughout the celebration of the ancient Olympics, reminding us of the fact that Prometheus took the fire from the gods as an act of liberation. Today, I'm honored to speak about and welcome a tradition that has its roots in the very heart of my homeland, Greece. Every 4 years, the Olympic flame lighting ceremony is held before its Olympiad at the site of ancient Olympia, symbolizing the commencement of the Olympic Games. On the 16th of April, 20 and 24, this ceremony was held at the historic site of ancient Olympia, and the flame was lit by the high priestess. Following this momentous event, on the 26th of April, the Olympic torch was ceremoniously handed over from Greece to France, marking the beginning of his journey to Marseille. It was at this stadium where the dreams of Pierre de Coubertin, the father of the modern Olympic Games, were first realized in 1896. Like the Olympic messengers of ancient times, who proclaimed the ekechiria, or sacred truce, the relay runners who pass on the Olympic flame bring a message of peace with them along with their path. Thus, this journey to France is a testament to the enduring spirit of the Olympics as the flame travels a remarkable 12,500 kilometers carried by 11,600 torchbearers, embodying the unity and friendship among nations that the game inspire. On July 26, the flame will reach its final destination. And the final destination is Paris, which is hosting Olympic Games after 100 years. Where it will light up the opening ceremony of the so-called 33rd Olympic Games. Dear friends, dear participants, in the 2024 Paris Olympic Games, we will have the chance to enjoy 32 Olympic sports and then later in September, 22 Paralympic sports in the Paralympic Games. 15,000 athletes will participate from 206 national Olympic committees and the International Committee Refugee Olympic Team, which represents more than 100 million forcibly displaced people worldwide. made up of 36 athletes from 11 different countries. Dear friends, throughout the Games, the flame will burn day and night, and it will burn in a special altar inside the Olympic Stadium of the host city, Paris. The flame, therefore, is more than a symbol. It is a representation of human ingenuity and resilience. Baron Pierre de Coubertin, in his vision for the modern Olympic Games, saw the flame as a vital link between the ancient and modern games, a torch passed down through generations, lighting the way for human progress and unity. As we stand on the brink of the 33rd Olympic Games, we extend our best wishes, of course, to France, and we hope that these Games will be a celebration of peace, unity, and the enduring human spirit. Dear colleagues, many times in this hemicycle, we speak about symbols. I said that the flame is something more than a symbol. I recall in my mind the famous phrase of a French president, François Mitterrand. He said that politics, and politics is not only what we are doing in the hemicycle, politics, according to my predecessor, the ancient Greeks, is the people being interested for other people, the people being interested for human rights, the people being interested and participating in the agora. I use the phrase, the word agora. It was a phrase, a word that my predecessor, Tini Cox, liked to use very often. And what was the agora? The agora was a place where all Athenians who invented the democracy were participating, and if I may use this phrase, they were forced to participate. Those who did not participate were considered as people who are today known with the British word, and Andrei, I heard that you have already mentioned it. I will tell it first in Greek. It is idiotis, idiotia, idiocy. Idiocy at that time was, as I mentioned, the prescription of those who didn't want to participate in the agora, of those who didn't want to participate in the decision taken by the people of Athenian democracy. Today it is known in English as idiot. You may be surprised, some of you, but this is actually the connection. And this is what we are trying to do here. And now I'm not addressing, of course, to my colleagues who are, and I want to thank them all for being here today in this historic moment for our hemicycle. I would like to address to the people who are invited and be with us. And I would like to tell you that sometimes I know that many people are wondering, what are you doing in this hemicycle? Are you just producing papers? Are you just producing reports? And I always reply, if we are present, if we work for democracy, if we shout about democracy, if we are standing by those who are always being oppressed, then we fulfill the cause which made the people who fought for us to bring us here in front of you. We know that many times we have to decide between different opponent opinions. Sometimes the dilemma is there. In our days, we face a lot of dilemmas. One of the most important is how to preserve democracy in our continent, how to preserve our values. To preserve our values while a war in Ukraine is going on. To preserve our values while a lot of people are following, unfortunately, sometimes those who are called, to say it in a most polite way, populist. We have to be aware the populists were all the time there, talking about my country, talking about Athens, my beloved city, talking about democracy. I want to say that even then, even in this Athenian democracy, there were a lot of populists. There were a lot of people who tried to make other people, to try to make Athenians to decide in a way that was not for the good of the people. And at that time, it was those who stood up like Socrates and said that we have to preserve our values. We have to support what we are here for. And we are here for the people. We are here for these values which in our Constitution, in our Chart of Rights, I'm talking about the Human Rights Charter, is human rights, rule of law, and democracy. I know that sometimes democracy is always being transformed. I know that democracy has to face a lot of dangers. One of them is coming up. We just decided some weeks ago to vote in this very hemicycle about the AI Convention. It is a work being done by a lot of colleagues, by the Secretariat, by people who do care. And if you ask me, but is AI something that we have to fear? I would say no. Is it a tool or a gun? I would say that it is a tool, and we must use it as a tool, not as a gun. Talking about guns, talking about war, and it is not only in Ukraine, the war we have in many other places. We see people suffering. I want to say that in my inaugural speech back in January, when I had the honor to be elected from this assembly unanimously, and I want to thank once again my colleagues as the president, I said that we fight in this place, we fight in this hemicycle, not with guns, not with ammunition, not with missiles, not anything else but words. We try to persuade each other. We have 5 political groups present in this hemicycle. For those who have been visiting the hemicycle for the first time, I want to tell you that we represent here 46 states, 700 million people, 612 parliamentarians are working with us every day. We may meet every 3 or 4 months, 4 times a year, but we still are here for what the people vote us and gave us the alliance, the allowance, the permittance to be. It is an obligation. It is an honor. So I see that the flame is almost outside of our building. And this flame reminds me that, I hope that you are not tired by listening to this lecture about, I can never forget that I'm not only a politician, I'm a professor, and on the other hand, I'm a historian. So it is not only the history of my country that I want to appraise, but it is the history of all countries of European Union, because we all together shaped this that we call European civilization, and how many people seek to these European values, want to be with us, work with us, live with us. The immigrants deserve what we have said in many of our reports, to be respected. And this is the way that we show that we are here for a purpose. A purpose which makes us people of democracy. Dear colleagues, so I will quote the Citius Altius Fortius, the phrase of Baron de Coubertin, which means faster, higher, stronger. And I would like to ask you now to join me in standing to welcome the Olympic flame to our hemicycle. Thank you for being so patient. welcome the Olympic flame of peace into the cradle of human rights. We welcome the Olympic flame of peace. We welcome the Olympic flame of peace into the cradle of human rights. We send our best wishes to the International Olympic Committee and to France for the organization of the Games of the 33rd Olympiad. Félicitations et meilleurs vœux à la France. Bonne route vers Paris. My fellow colleagues would like you to remain for the debate, and they would be very happy if the hemicycle will always be as full as it is now.
Will they stay for the president? Or will you replace him?
He stays now.
του είναι στο 2060. Pablo. Okay, dear colleagues, I would like to ask you to be seated so that we can go on at our debate. We are now to give the floor to Mr. Pablo Hispan, who will speak on behalf of the European People's Party. Pablo, you have the floor.
President, I would like to start by congratulating Lord Keane, our rapporteur, for this excellent, indeed extraordinary report. As Immanuel Kant, durable peace, lasting peace, is a dream which seems to exist only in cemeteries. The past century have been marked by a series of wars which have torn apart society. Fukuyama talked about the end of history, but that didn't bring the end of conflicts. Indeed, it was almost the opposite. Since 1939, conflicts have speeded up. They've accelerated and escalated. And one of the high points we reached was in the 90s in the Balkans. More recently, of course, the illegal war against Ukraine. Since 1949 and the Treaty of London, which led to the setting up of this institution, and since 1950, with the adoption of the European Convention of Human Rights, we've been creating the foundations for fundamental rights for all Europeans. The Human Rights Court is one of the most important tools in this process. All sorts of landmarks are achieved during any conflict. Redress for victims and reconciliation is, of course, important. The process of memory is, of course, brings us towards agreement. Lord Keane's report, which the EPP supports, addresses the question of mediation while looking at the conditions necessary to enable the Council of Europe to play a role. Of course, those conditions must enhance the role and ability of the institution to act. The Committee of Ministers, the Parliamentary Assembly and the Secretary-General can initiate this process even without consent from the two parties. When it comes to the Assembly, we can do this via resolution which requires the support of members. Within the Council of Europe and its members, we can only do this to address specific questions. This cannot concern countries outside the Council. We're able to address conflicts between member states so as to avoid new wars or conflicts breaking out. When it comes to reparation and the role of the European Court of Human Rights, the idea is always to ensure that the main focus is the needs and interests of victims. The states involved have the duty to cooperate, and if they don't cooperate, there will be consequences. If they refuse to cooperate, this will be a violation of Article 3 of the Convention of the Council of Europe. This is accompanied by a series of standards regarding reparation and reconciliation so as to enable us to move towards finding solutions to complex situations. The unimaginable happened. Russia attacked Ukraine, which means this mediation process didn't come into effect. Perhaps with it, things might have turned out differently. We need to take a new look at the mediation principle. This is a diplomatic tool based on cooperation. But in the light of the limits of theory, we think the time has come to put forward new initiatives so as to make such conflicts impossible in future. We have to try to promote a political path forward, a long process involving the European Court of Human Rights. We should give the world of politics and diplomacy, including the Parliamentary Assembly, the opportunity to try to address these issues. We're aware of the fact that new conflicts might, of course, arise, and this institution must be well prepared to both prevent them and to provide reparation and redress. The EPP supports this report and the measures proposed. It's important that we continue to work so as to have a global approach to promoting these mediation tools in conflicts, once again, based on the idea of reparation and redress for the most vulnerable. We have to continue to work on commemoration and memory. I'd like to thank everybody who's been involved in this report, which is, of course, an important step so as to ensure the Council of Europe has the tools it needs to address crises affecting more than one of its members. Thank you.
Thank you, Pablo. I now give the floor to Anna Eftimiou.
Mr. Chairman, I thank the reporter, Lord Richard Keane, for all the work he has put in this report, as well as for his good intentions in strengthening the involvement of the Council of Europe in the peacemaking process. I would also like to thank Mr. George Lukaidis for his valuable contribution in the preparation of the opinion of the Committee of Political Affairs and Democracy. The need for reconciliation and fair compensation for victims cannot be overstated. As the report rightly points out, the absence of meaningful progress in these areas can perpetuate a sense of injustice and potentially lead in the resurgence of hostilities. The Council of Europe, indeed, has a significant role to play in helping member states navigate the complex terrain of post-conflict reconciliation, ensuring that past grievances do not become future conflicts. While I endorse the proposal to consider establishing a new mediation mechanism under the shield of the Council of Europe, I must express some reservations regarding specific aspects of the proposed parameters. First and foremost, it is crucial that any new mediation mechanism should not circumvent or undermine the European Convention on Human Rights and the European Court on Human Rights. Integrating mediation into the implementation phase of court judgments must be approached with caution. Mediation should not be perceived as an alternative to the execution of court judgments, which are binding obligations. It is imperative that the court judgments remain distinct and not be conflated with mediation efforts. Moreover, interstate cases often involve serious and widespread human rights violations, which could never become the object of negotiations. These cases should remain under the exclusive jurisdiction of the court to ensure that justice is fully served. This cornerstone is particularly pertinent with regard to the suggestion that mediation might be initiated without the consent of both parties involved. Initiating mediation without such consent could be counterproductive and may intensify tensions rather than resolve them. For all those reasons, Mr. Chairman, I would not be able to support the report as its current form. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. Larissa Bilozer, you're next.
I would like to extend my gratitude to the rapporteur, Lord Richard Keane, for presenting this historically significant report in historical day when the Olympic flame here, first in the history of Parliament Assembly of Council of Europe, is here with us, which outlines the path towards building a future with lasting peace. Crucial aspect of our mandate is to improve reconciliation and repatriation process among other member states via mediation. Our organization is a beacon of hope for human rights and the rule of law, and we must do everything possible to heal wounds, restore dignity of all victims. But while the time is ticking, people lose hope. According to the recent research conducted by the Kharkiv Institute of Social Research, if you ask, do Ukrainians believe in the possibility of receiving reparation from Russia? Only 25% believe it could happen. Because of the war, almost 50% of Ukrainians suffered mental trauma. 90% mentions that their chronic diseases worsen or they develop new ones. It's been 10 years of war and 2 years since full-scale invasion. People face trauma every day. All families are traumatized in Ukraine. They need a guarantee that the story of each of them is taken into account. they seek not just legal instruments. It's not just about material compensation. It is also about moral damages and acknowledging their suffering and that justice is prevailing and there is no impunity. Otherwise, how can we be sure that they are not forgotten? How would that influence their faith in democracy? How would that influence people's faith in us who are obliged to protect and help them? I think we all know the answer to these questions. The point of our organization is not only to resolve the existing problems, but to prevent the future ones. We speak on the welfare of not only today's, but of future generations, as well as enhancing our mediation efforts and developing a robust toolkits for reparation. We can lay the foundation for future peace. This is not just about resolving current conflicts, but about preventing future ones. Be reminded that after the end of this terrible war that Russia launched in Ukraine, all of us will have a test of ensuring justice for victims, a test of what we can do to help our people. If we fail, we will also fail to establish peace for our children, our grandchildren, and all the future generations. And we cannot and will not allow it. Thank you, colleagues.
Thank you, Larissa. Armen Rustamyan is next.
Merci.
Thank you, President. President, dear colleagues, obviously the reparation and reconciliation process is vital in order to overcome past conflicts and to consolidate pace. But in order to ensure that the conflict doesn't break out anew, it's important to make sure that any sense of injustice is eliminated when it comes to the way in which the conflict is settled. Otherwise, the risk is that the conflict will persist. Because you can't really re-establish pace if it is the aggressor who is the victor, and there can be no lasting peace if you don't have justice and truth. Azerbaijan, for example, claims that there is no conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh anymore because it has resolved it via a war which it instigated itself. It forced out Armenians from Karabakh, and it is therefore empty. And now Azerbaijan says that the conflict has been resolved. And their idea is there's nobody left, and therefore there's no problem. And Azerbaijan seems to feel that it can get further concessions from Armenia because it is the victor. If we allow international law to be replaced by the rule of the strongest, there will never be peace in our world. And I would like to recall Azerbaijan's commitment in favor of a peaceful settlement of the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict. And therefore, this assembly should reiterate its condemnation of the military operation instigated by the Azeri army in Karabakh on the 19th of September last. A clear message must be sent that the political and ethnic conflict which goes back so far between Armenia and Azerbaijan on all kinds of grounds, and not least Nagorno-Karabakh, can only be resolved exclusively at the negotiation table and not by war. The members of the Council of Europe must contribute to the lasting sustainable stability of the Caucasus region in keeping with international norms, especially given the forthcoming United Nations conference on climate change, which will take place in Baku this year. Delegations taking part in that conference have a particular responsibility in this regard. Monitoring the situation in general is also a vital task for the new Secretary General and for the Human Rights Commissioner, and all access to all necessary information must be ensured for them. Thank you.
Yuri Kamilchuk is next.
Dear Chairman, honourable members of Parliamentary Assembly, I would like to thank our excellent rapporteurs, Lord Richard Keane and Mr. George Lukiades. The challenge before us is not only to address the remnants of past conflicts, but to lay the foundations of a common, peaceful future through just and equal redress. Reparation and reconciliation are cornerstone processes in healing nations and building sustainable peace. These processes must be comprehensive and inclusive, ensuring that all victims of conflict receive recognition and redress. This is not only merely a matter of moral duty, but of creating a stable and just society. We must first ensure the reparations are both substantive and symbolic, addressing the material and immaterial injuries suffered. Financial compensation, while necessary, is not sufficient alone. We must also include measures such as restoring property, acknowledgement of injustices, and guarantees of non-recurrence. Secondly, reconciliation must go beyond political agreements and enter the hearts and minds of individuals. This requires fostering dialogue between conflicting parties, promoting understanding and sometimes forgiveness. Education plays a critical role here, teaching younger generation the truth of the past to prevent the cycles of violence from repeating. Moreover, the international community, through bodies like this Assembly, must support local efforts by providing the necessary legal frameworks, funding, and expertise to ensure that the reparation and reconciliation processes not only begin but are brought to fruition. Finally, we must recognize that justice is a critical component of these processes. The European Court of Human Rights has a key role in this process. Justice should not be retributive, but restorative, focusing on repairing harm and rebuilding relationships rather than merely punishing offenders. This approach reinforces the respect for human rights and the rule of law, which are essential for lasting peace. In conclusion, reparation and reconciliation are not merely policy options, but obligation to those we serve. Let us commit to these principles, ensuring that they are applied equally and justly, so that together we can overcome the shadows of past conflicts and build a future that values peace, justice, and human dignity. Thank you.
Thank you, Yuri. Abdurrahman Babachan is next.
Thank you, dear Chair. We will need some key concepts to discuss the European ideal, its mission from past to present, and point it has reached today. In that regard, we need to be interested on what liberal democracy offers to societies: social justice, welfare, progress, inclusiveness, equality of human rights to everyone, and protection of human dignity. In the modern period, recently, European nations came together and built a number of international and supranational norms and institutions, including the umbrella structure we are in, to reverse the catastrophic climate of World War II, which crushed and eliminated all of the above-mentioned elements to flourish. This was undoubtedly one of the most progressive, courageous, and successful steps in recent history. The senior norm was liberal democracy and its principles. While the Cold War period provided Europe with the opportunity to progress on a smooth and uneven path, it also offered Europe a very good and convenient ground for the political, cultural, sociological, and economic development and settlement of European democracies. While relying on the conformism of the black politics during the Cold War, European states had the opportunity to repair themselves, advance and strengthen their development process in this while. But, in my opinion, the real test for European politics, its sociological and cultural projection and its economic future began with the end of the Cold War period, which would also mean exit from that field of conformism, of cowering, of postponing, and of preserving. Global and national politics open in a brand new, more uncertain, more chaotic, more unprotected field for politics. The era has begun as new conflictual issues, speeding and diffusion of migration, economic contraction, micronationalisms, non-state structures integration and impacting the political area, and usage of global and regional terrorism as leveraging struggles between states. As a matter of fact, right after the end of the Cold War in early 90s, Europe experienced this in its own geography with the Bosnian War and the Kosovo War. The test it would give would be a sign that would shed light on Europe's political influence, political vision, and sociological projection for the new era. I think that Europe has not been able to develop a vision first for itself, and then to drag everyone in this unprotected political and sociological ground. This lack of policy, which started with these tests, continued as negatively for Europe with the way it engaged in American politics after 9/11, the way it reacted to the Balkans, the Middle East, Africa, and transoceanic problems, and its political ineffectiveness evolved into a growing disappointment and a deep way in Europe's own societies, and as well as in world nations. This was basically a wave of disappointment and reaction towards Europe's mainstream political style and understanding, and the serious problems in practice that derive from it. That's why Europe should look at challenges from the question of where its internal political and sociological dynamics will evolve, to the problem of image and value loss it has experienced on a global scale, how it will shape its defense and security architecture in context of Russia, Ukraine, and NATO, and how it will shape the post-American Europe formation from this fundamental basis. Thanks.
Thank you. Let's go now to Brian Francis.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Chair. Can you hear me? Good. Okay. Dear colleagues, I'm very pleased that this Assembly is looking into reparation and reconciliation processes to overcome past conflicts and to highlight the stories of victims. As an Indigenous parliamentarian, this topic is of great importance to me. To enrich today's debate, I want to focus on the process of reconciliation in Canada. Due to a history of colonialism and genocide, Indigenous people in Canada have endured many hardships. For example, for over 150 years, more than 150,000 Indigenous children were forced to attend institutions known as residential schools, which sought to assimilate them into Christian and Euro-Canadian culture. While at these institutions, Indigenous children were separated from their families and forbidden from speaking their languages and practicing their cultures. Many died, and their families were not told what happened or where they were buried. This history has been brought to light because of the strength, courage, and determination of those who survived these institutions. And announcements made since 2021 about several potential unmarked burials at or near residential schools have sparked a national reckoning over Canada's treatment of Indigenous peoples. An important step in the process of reconciliation happened in 2007 when the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement came into effect. It led to the establishment of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada in 2008. In 2015, the Commission released a final report which concluded that this system amounted to cultural genocide. It also outlined 94 calls to action which serve as a roadmap for advancing reconciliation from words to action. In 2021, in line with call to action number 80, I had the privilege of sponsoring a bill through the Senate which created the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, now a federal statutory holiday held on September 30th of each year. As Rapporteur Keane explains here, truth-seeking initiatives are crucial to lasting peace and reconciliation. Nevertheless, the path to reconciliation is not linear. In 2023, the Yellowhead Institute found that 8 years since the release of the 94 calls to action, 81 calls remained unfilled. In addition, the violence of residential school denialism persists in Canada. The impact of denialism is profound. It invalidates painful experiences, perpetuates discriminatory and racist beliefs and practices, and hinders progress towards reconciliation. As the Commission stated in 2015, without truth, there can be no genuine reconciliation. I would like to thank Lord Keane for his excellent report, and I hope that these few insights into the process of reconciliation in Canada can further contribute to your reflections on how to build a common and peaceful future. Walalan, merci, thank you.
Thank you, Brian. Mr. Mularczyk is next. Arkadiusz, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, dear colleagues. I would like to start by thanking Lord Richard Keane for drafting a far-reaching report that proposes a real solution to resolving conflict between states of Council of Europe and potentially beyond, and to resolving the issue concerning compensation and reparation. Other potential avenues that exist to resolve conflict and seek redress can be blocked or simply ignored. Here there is finally a proposal that will allow victim states and victims to find redress and bring aggressor states to the negotiation table. This is particularly important as history has shown that aggressors are relatively quick to be punished, but victims can be ignored for decades, potentially forever. This is a huge step towards making the Council of Europe a leader in terms of resolving conflict, but also for the Council of Europe to pose a warning to aggressor states. There finally is a mechanism that will make you engage and stop you from hiding from your responsibilities towards victims. I fully support this report, the resolution and recommendation, and I hope that the Council of Europe make fast progress in establishing this mechanism. Finally, for this reason, I strongly recommend that everyone votes against the proposed amendments that aim to prevent this mechanism from being created. Thank you very much.
Thank you, dear Arkadiusz. Olena Mosenec is next.
I would like to thank Lord Richard Keane for focus on building a peaceful future. Ukrainians are more than anyone else interested in ending of war, moving on to rebuilding the country and bringing people home. These aspirations were presented this month in Switzerland at the first peace summit, which promoted the President Zelensky peace formula, including its aspects such as nuclear security, food security, the release of all prisoners of war through a full exchange, and the return of all deported civilians and children. As of 25th June, the joint communiqué was supported by 88 countries and organizations, including the Council of Europe. Thank you very much, dear colleagues. Before the summit, the Russian dictator tried to destabilize the Ukrainian peace initiative by declaring his readiness to start negotiations with Ukraine on the condition that Ukraine withdraws its troops from the entire territory of Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson regions. 18 of Ukraine's territory. For example, 18% of Ukrainian land is almost the entire territory of Bulgaria or the entire territory of Iceland. The report pays significant attention to mediation and negotiations for peace. The Ukrainian Foreign Ministry does not include the prospect of Russia's participation in the second peace summit in a format similar to the Black Sea Grain Initiative. Back then, Turkey and the UN acted as mediators in the negotiations process, and the agreement looked like a document signed between Turkey, UN, Ukraine, and Turkey, UN, Russia. The initiative allowed for the safe export of almost 33 million tons of grain and food to 45 countries. But we should remember that agreements with Russia are not worth the paper they are written on. In July 2023, Russia withdrew from the Black Sea Grain Initiative, once again putting the work at risk of a food crisis. Ukraine remembers the bitter experience of the Budapest Memorandum, under which Russia acted as a guarantor of Ukrainian security in the face of Ukraine's giving up the world's third nuclear potential. The guarantor of our security undermined it 10 years ago and launched a full-scale war in February 2022. Given this experience, Ukraine has been actively signed bilateral security assurance agreements that provide us with assistance on an ongoing basis. As of today, such agreements are in place with the UK, France, Germany, Denmark, Italy, Canada, the Netherlands, Finland, Latvia, Spain, Belgium, Portugal, Sweden, Norway, Iceland, Japan, and the United States. The list of countries is growing. Thank you, partners and friends. We also do not see a peaceful future and reconciliation process without full compensation for the damage caused by Russian aggression. We are convinced that every Russian asset, every ruble should be spent on rebuilding destroyed schools and hospitals, energy facilities and homes where peace and life once existed. Ukraine knows the price of peaceful sky. However, we can call the research for mechanisms that would truly ensure peace in the long term.
Thank you, Elena.
And turn the words "never again" into action. Thank you.
Mr. Sanchez Garcia is next.
Monsieur le Président.
President, reconciliation and reparation are vital to put an end to conflict, but that's clear. But you can't get reconciliation when one of the parties is determined to continue with the conflict. This is the situation in Spain when it comes to Catalan separatism. Following the non-care efforts in 2017, but this did lead to the criminal convictions of Catalan leaders, which they were convicted of sedition. Subsequently, the Communist and Socialist coalition in Spain, which has been in power since 2020, pardoned a number of those that had been convicted, and some of them didn't even repent what they had done, but they are continuing in what they are trying to achieve, that is to say, the secession of Catalonia from Spain. And even worse was an amnesty law that has been enacted just last week, and this means and that these people are going to, having been pardoned, they're going to continue with this path. This amnesty was pronounced by the socialist government, including other parties, separatist parties from Catalonia. And it was on this basis that the new government was voted in. But the socialist government had actually lost the most recent elections. International law recognizes self-determination for people like the Catalan people, including in democracies. But this mustn't damage the rights of the other Spaniards, and pursuant to Article 4.2 of the European Union, with respect to other peoples in the European Union. This is also against the Charter, the European Union's Charter of Fundamental Rights, which establishes the question of whether retroactive laws can be deemed to be licit. This, for instance, goes against the principle of territorial integrity of states which international law and by the United Nations and by the European Union have been determined to be such. Thank you.
David Wells is next.
Dear colleagues,
The European continent has borne witness to many atrocities and wars over the centuries and continues to in Ukraine today. Naturally, in the wake of these atrocities, and even as they unfold, the question of reparations and post-conflict reconciliation arises time and time again. And time again, we struggle to come up with a just approach. As Rapporteur Keane rightly points out, post-war discussions on the questions of reparations and post-conflict reconciliation often, quote, do not lead to adequate results and can create a feeling of injustice, which can, in turn, perpetuate conflicts or even lead to a resumption of hostilities, close quote. This has been the case, for example, with World War II reparations, which the report reminds us were complex given the scale of the human rights violations and the huge impact on civilian populations. To this day, over 3/4 of a century later, the complexity of that particular example continues to be a source of disagreement. To quote the report, there continue to be arguments that reparations that have not been fair or full, with specific individuals feeling they did not receive adequate compensation, and some continuing to pursue reparations from Germany for losses suffered, close quote. The past, as William Faulkner once said, is never dead. It isn't even past. We continue to consider the complex legal and moral questions of just and equal redress. Does it mean full reparation? How far back in history do we go? Should the crimes or pain of one generation be passed on to the next? I don't pretend to have the answers to these questions, and I thank Lord Keane for taking them on through the recommendations in his important report. I agree that, as it's quoted, that the Council of Europe has a clear role to play in improving reconciliation and reparation processes amongst its members. And I also agree that the Council of Europe-led mediation process, accompanied by an improved toolkit that stands for reparation and reconciliation, could begin to provide a path forward. Though Ukraine was not the focus of the report, and Lord Keane envisions the proposed process only applying to Council of Europe member states, I would be remiss if I didn't say that Russia's war of aggression has reminded us that the age-old question of just and equal redress remains with us today. Thank you, colleagues.
Thank you. Tamara Vonda is next.
Thank you. Dear colleagues, the report underscores a crucial aspect of our collective responsibility, addressing the legacy of conflict through just and equitable redress. It emphasized the significance of negotiation and processes aimed at addressing the damage caused by conflict and moving towards reconciliation. However, these efforts too often fall short, creating a sense of injustice that can perpetuate conflict or even lead to a resurgence of hostilities. It is clear that existing mechanisms are inadequate and providing timely, enforceable responses to disputes between member states post-conflict. The Council of Europe is uniquely positioned to promote solutions fostering justice, cooperation, and peace. Our statutory commitment compels us to pursue peace based on justice and international cooperation. However, despite the tools at our disposal, such as political discourse within the Assembly, the Committee of Ministers, and the jurisdiction of the European Court of Human Rights, these often do not suffice. To bridge this gap, the report advocates for a new adaptive mechanism under the auspices of the Council of Europe. Mechanism would aim to resolve interstate disputes post-conflict more effectively and improve the enforcement of any awards. A mediated solution involving neutral third parties, such as international mediators or former judges of renown, can offer a holistic approach to resolving complex matters, ensuring greater buy-in from states and victims, thus and change the chances of successful enforcement. This approach is not only about providing justice in a legal sense, but about addressing the emotional and psychological needs of victims, ensuring their voices and heard and their pain acknowledged. Therefore, mediation process should be flexible, victim-centered, and context-specific. It should involve consultation with victims and affected groups, ensuring their needs are central to the solutions proposed. It is crucial that member states engage with this process in good faith, and there should be reparation for those failing to cooperate sincerely. The Assembly should also develop an improved toolkit and standard for reparation and reconciliation. This toolkit should offer a range of adaptable solutions, avoiding a one-size-fits-all approach and ensuring that remedies are achievable, enforceable, and implementable. By endorsing this recommendation, we would reaffirm our commitment to justice, human rights, and peace. By embracing a victim-centered, adaptable, and cooperative framework, the Council of Europe can play a role in healing the wounds of the past and building a foundation for a peaceful future. Let us commit to these principles and work together. Thank you.
Thank you. Dear colleagues, I must now interrupt the list of speakers. The speeches of members on the speakers list who have been present during the debate but have not been able to speak may be given to the table office for publication in the official report. I remind colleagues that the type written text can be submitted electronically, if possible, no later than 4 hours after the list of speakers is interrupted. I now call Lord Keane, Rapporteur, to reply. Lord Keane, you have 3 minutes.
Thank you, President. Thank you, colleagues, for all your contributions today. And thank you to those such as Mr. Mlajic, who engaged with me during the preparation of this report. That was greatly appreciated. It does appear to me that the difference of opinion that has emerged rests upon a misunderstanding. We're presented with the suggestion that this is black and white, that on the one hand, only the parties will agree to mediation, and that's an end to the matter. On the other hand, it will be mandatory for disputes to go to mediation. I invite colleagues to look more carefully at the terms of the report, and in particular Articles 69 and 71. And let me explain why. The whole purpose of the proposal on mediation is that in circumstances where the Committee of Ministers or this Parliamentary Assembly decide in their collective wisdom that a dispute is capable, in their view, of mediation, then the parties are bound to engage in good faith with that process. And that follows from the terms of our statute and from the terms of Article 3. So what we have is not black and white. What we have is a situation in which not every dispute or many disputes will go to mediation. What we have is a situation in which the Committee of Ministers or this Assembly, in their collective wisdom, say, notwithstanding the parties' subjective reaction, we believe that objectively it would be wise to attempt mediation. Once that decision is made by the Committee of Ministers or passed by this Assembly, then, of course, every member would have an obligation to meet that recommendation in good faith and with sincerity, which is what we should do with all our obligations in terms of the statute and under the provisions of this Council. So I must reject the idea that somehow we're placing some mandatory obligation on parties without any consideration. What we're doing is replacing the reactive, subjective judgment of the two parties to a dispute with an objective assessment based upon the collective wisdom of the Committee of Ministers or this Parliamentary Assembly. Only if they decide in their collective wisdom that a mediation may be the way forward will it then be called upon the parties to engage with that in good faith. And that is why I will oppose the amendments that are going to be put forward, which say that it should only be in circumstances where the parties agree that mediation should take place. That, frankly, would leave this report as a dead letter. It would leave the recommendation and resolution as a dead letter. It wouldn't take us anywhere at all. So I ask colleagues to consider very carefully what the report actually says at Article 69, Article 71, and I thank colleagues again for their very material contributions today. Thank you.
Thank you. So now the debate is closed. The Committee of Legal Affairs and Human Rights has presented a draft resolution to which 5 amendments have been tabled. Sorry, does the Vice Chairperson of the committee wish to speak? Sorry, so sorry.
Thank you. President, I shall speak on behalf of the committee. Lord Keane, our rapporteur, deserves praise for an insightful report on how to manage post-conflict societies and how to bring back the peaceful coexistence of nations. The committee also thanks George Lukaidis as rapporteur for opinion on this very important topic. The role of reparation and reconciliation cannot be stressed enough in our world plagued by wars and violent conflicts. The title of this report rightly starts with the word reparation, which precedes the word reconciliation. Essentially, this means that the wrongdoers must first acknowledge and pay for the wrong done, and only then can actual full reconciliation happen. This report is also about methods for lasting peace, achievable through instruments of repairing harm, paying back damages, and acknowledging the wrong done by the perpetrators. As first Vice Chair of the Committee on Legal Affairs and Human Rights, I should like to stress that our rapporteur has had the full support of the committee, which adopted his report by a very large majority and rejected all amendments apart from the 2 amendments approved by the rapporteur, which are 1 and 6. The conciliation mechanism the rapporteur is suggesting is intended to supplement, not replace, any of the existing mechanisms, such as the Court of Human Rights, for example. Such a mechanism is of no use if it is left with no teeth or as a dead letter, as our rapporteur has just said. Whether the Committee of Ministers will be ready to follow all of our recommendations right away or not should not prevent us from making a strong proposal now. So I invite you to support this report without pulling any of its teeth or all of its teeth. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now the debate is closed for real. The Committee of Legal Affairs and Human Rights has presented a draft resolution to which 5 amendments have been tabled. The Committee on Legal Affairs and Human Rights has also presented a draft recommendation to which 5 amendments have been tabled. They will be taken in the order in which they appear in the compendium. I remind you that speeches on amendments are limited to 30 seconds. Any amendment which has been unanimously approved by the committee, sized for report shall not be put to the vote in plenary and shall be declared as definitively approved unless 10 or more members of the Assembly object. I understand that the chairperson of the Committee on Legal Affairs and Human Rights wishes to propose to the Assembly that Amendment 1 to the draft resolution and Amendment 6 to the draft recommendation, which were unanimously approved by the committee, should be declared as approved. Is that so, Lord Richard Keane?
Thank you, President. That is the case.
Thank you. If no one objects, I will consider the amendments to be approved. Is there any objection? Okay, if there is, we will need to verify that the objection has the required support of 10 people. So please, once again, could you, those who object, raise their hands? There is no, as I can see, so. Amendment 1 to the draft resolution and Amendment 6 to the draft recommendation are therefore approved and will not be called. Any amendment which has been rejected by the committee, save for the report by a 2/3 majority of the votes, shall not be put to the vote in plenary and shall be declared as definitively rejected unless 10 or more members of the Assembly object. I understand that the chairperson of the committee wishes to propose to the Assembly that Amendment 2 to the draft resolution, which was rejected by the committee with 2/3 majority, be declared as rejected. Is that so, Lord Richard Keane?
It was rejected by the committee. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. If no one objects, I will consider the amendments to be rejected. Is there any objection? If there is, we will need to verify that the objection has the required support of 10 people. Please, could those who object raise their hand? Uh-huh.
4, 5, 6, 7, 8.
8.
You're fewer than 10.
You're fewer than 10, so amendment 2 to the draft resolution is therefore rejected and will not be called. Thank you. Mm-hmm.
Page 50.
Okay. I call Mr. George Loukaides on behalf of the Committee on Political Affairs and Democracy to support Amendment 3. You have 30 seconds.
This amendment, as all the others in the resolution, in the commentation, express our reservations in relation to the mandatory character of this proposal for a new mediation mechanism. There is no other precedent in international or regional organizations where such a process is a mandatory one. So the proposal is to leave it as voluntary and allow me to say that the proposals that were unanimously accepted by the Political Affairs Committee were rejected in the Legal Affairs Committee by only one vote against and one vote in favor. I repeat, one vote against the proposals for amendments of the Political Affairs Committee and one vote in favor. That's the way they have all been rejected, except from the first one, before the discussion made in the Legal Affairs Committee. So our aim is not to undermine this proposal for a new mediation mechanism, but on the contrary, to make it possible to be seen by the Committee of Ministers in a more positive way. Otherwise, if it goes as it is now, and I'm talking about all the amendments because directly or indirectly are related to the mandatory character of this mechanism, then it will have much less possibility to be accepted. Thank you.
Thank you. Does anyone wish to speak against the amendment? Lord Keane.
President and colleagues, it seems to me that the term mandatory is not really being used in an appropriate fashion. What we are saying in the report is that if, in their collective wisdom, the Committee of Ministers or this Parliamentary Assembly, by voting a recommendation, consider that mediation should be undertaken, then there will be an obligation on parties to engage with that process in good faith. That is all that is being said. It's in that context that we have to consider this amendment, which would defang the report.
Thank you. What is the opinion of the committee?
The committee has rejected this amendment.
Thank you. I shall now put the amendment to the vote. The vote is open. The vote is closed. I call for the result to be displayed. Amendment 3 is rejected. I call Mr. George Loukaides on behalf of the Committee on Political Affairs and Democracy to support Amendment 4. You have 30 seconds, please.
Once more, I would like to remind you that these amendments and the following were rejected in the Legal Affairs Committee with just one vote against, only one vote against. So the reason for tabling this amendment by the Political Affairs Committee is that we believe that the Assembly should not, from the very start, threaten Member States with repercussions, in other words, sanctions. This approach does not seem constructive, and as I said before, it will reduce chances for this initiative to be positively considered by the Committee of Ministers.
Thank you. Does anyone wish to speak against the amendment? Yes, Lord King.
Colleagues, all of the remaining amendments proceed upon the same basis as the one that's already been rejected. In other words, the whole issue of what is meant by mandatory. So I invite colleagues to be consistent in this matter and to reject each of these amendments in turn. Thank you.
Thank you. I shall now put the amendment to the vote. The vote is open. Is there everything okay with voting rights for? Okay. So the vote is open. It's okay now. Okay. The vote is closed. I call for the result to be displayed.
No, but I said there was a problem.
Yes?
I'm not sure that you can close the vote if they couldn't vote.
Okay, then as there were problems, the vote will be rerun. We will rerun voting. There are technical problems, so we will arrange so that you can have right for voting, of course. Sorry, perhaps you should try on another place? It's the same with all places, with all numbers? Okay. It's now okay? Okay. So, I think that we can now, the vote is open. So please vote.
I'm sorry, but
it's okay.
Then we would have
The vote is closed, and I call for the result to be displayed. Amendment 4 is rejected. I call Mr. George Loukaitis on behalf of the Committee on Political Affairs and Democracy to support Amendment 5. You have 30 seconds. Please take the floor.
Once more, Madam Chair, a mandatory mediation procedure will be counterproductive. We fully support the proposal for this mediation mechanism, but not with a mandatory purpose. That's why unanimously the Political Affairs Committee proposed also these amendments and the amendments following. Thank you.
Thank you. Does anyone wish to speak against the amendment? Mr. Lord Keane.
Thank you, President. Again, the same issue arises for each of these amendments. We rely upon the collective wisdom of the Commission of Ministers, the Committee of Ministers, or of this Assembly. And it's only in that sense that you could regard the term mandatory as having any relevance here. Thank you.
Thank you. What is the opinion of the committee?
The committee rejected Amendment 5 as it did Amendment 4. Thank you.
Thank you. I shall now put the amendment to the vote. The vote is open. Okay. The vote is closed. I call for the result to be displayed. Amendment 5 is rejected. We will now proceed to vote on the draft resolution contained in document 15933. A simple majority is required. The vote is open. The vote is closed. I call for the result to be displayed. Okay. The draft resolution in document 15933 is adopted. Okay. I call Mr. George Loukadis on behalf of the Committee on Political Affairs and Democracy to support Amendment 7. You have 30 seconds.
The argumentation is the same, Madam President. It's the very same amendments that we've proposed in relation to the resolution. The very same amendments are for the recommendation as well. So there is no need to repeat all the argumentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Does anyone wish to speak against the amendment? Lord King.
President, colleagues, the position remains the same. All of these amendments fall into the same category. And again, I urge colleagues to reject the amendments. Thank you.
Thank you. What is the opinion of the committee?
Rejected Amendment 7.
Thank you. I shall now put the amendment to the vote. The vote is open. The vote is closed, and I call for the result to be displayed. Amendment 7 is rejected. I call Mr. George Loukadis on behalf of the Committee on Political Affairs and Democracy to support Amendment 8. You have 30 seconds.
The same as before, Madam President.
Thank you. Does anyone wish to speak against the amendment? Lord King, please.
Thank you, President. Colleagues, the position remains as before. Thank you.
Thank you. What is the opinion of the committee?
Rejected this amendment.
Thank you. I shall now put the amendment to the vote. The vote is open. I call for the result to be displayed. Amendment 8 is rejected. I call Mr. George Loukadis on behalf of the Committee on Political Affairs and Democracy to support Amendment 9. You have 30 seconds.
Gain time, the same as before.
Thank you. Does anyone wish to speak against the amendment? Lord King.
President, colleagues, I would urge you to vote no to this amendment. Thank you.
Thank you. Opinion of the committee, please.
The committee has rejected this amendment.
Thank you. I shall now put the amendment to the vote. The vote is open. The vote is closed. I call for the result to be displayed. Amendment 9 is rejected. I call Mr. George Loukadis on behalf of the Committee on Political Affairs and Democracy to support Amendment 10. The same. Does anyone wish to speak against? Lord King?
I urge you to vote no to this amendment. All I can add is mutatis mutandis.
Thank you. The opinion of the committee, please.
He has rejected this amendment.
Thank you. I shall now put the amendment to the vote. The vote is open. The vote is closed. I call for the result to be displayed. Amendment 10 is rejected. We will now proceed to vote on the draft recommendation contained in document 15933. I remind you that a 2/3 majority is required. So the vote is open. The vote is closed, and I call for the result to be displayed. The draft recommendation in document 15933 is adopted. The next item of business this afternoon is the debate on the report titled The Honoring of Obligation and Commitments by Armenia, document 15994, presented by Mr. Kimmo Kiljunen and Ms. Boriana Eberg on behalf of the Committee on the Honoring of Obligation and Commitments by Member States of the Council of Europe Monitoring Committee. In order to finish by 8 p.m., I will interrupt the list of speakers at about 7:50 p.m. to allow time for the reply and the vote. We will begin with Mr. Kiljunen and Ms. Eberg, co-rapporteur. You have 5 minutes each now and 5 minutes in total to replay to the debate. I call Mr. Kiljunen. The floor is yours. We will just wait for a minute or two to get Mr. Kiljunen in the hemicycle. Okay, then we will start with Mrs. Eberg. Yes, of course. Take your time. Okay, thank you. Please, the floor is yours, Mrs. Eberg.
Thank you, Madam President. Dear colleagues, presenting this report on Armenia is a special moment for Mr. Kiljunen and me. We were both appointed in 2021, and since then we have shared the ups and downs of the Armenian people. In 2022, we praised the progress of democratic developments and the fact that Armenia had successfully emerged from the political crisis triggered by the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict. However, since then, the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict has been revived. In September 2022, Azerbaijan launched major military operations along the border with Armenia and occupied parts of Armenian territory. In December 2022, Azerbaijan isolated the population of Nagorno-Karabakh from the rest of the world by occupying the Lachin corridor, cynically pretending that this was the action of eco-activists. The monitoring committee, and then PACE, requested authorization for a fact-finding visit, which was refused. In February 2022, we went to Armenia and did our best to warn about the fate of the population of Nagorno-Karabakh. After 9 long months of deprivation, Azerbaijan attacked the territory in September 2023, while Russian peacekeepers sat and watched. More than 100,000 people fled to Armenia in a week, emptying Nagorno-Karabakh of its population. Of course, Nagorno-Karabakh is not a part of internationally recognized Armenian territory, and as such is not within the scope of our report. However, a political crisis inevitably followed these events, with large street protests demanding the resignation of Prime Minister Pashinyan. In recent weeks, a new protest movement led by Archbishop Bagrat Galstanian has taken to the streets over the issue of border delimitation with Azerbaijan. Despite these challenges, the legitimacy of the institution has not been undermined, largely because the vast majority of the Armenian population wants peace, and also thanks to the legitimacy provided by democratic elections. Despite the difficult context, Armenia has continued on the path towards democratic reforms. This is the most important message our report seeks to share with you, dear colleagues. The reforms undertaken cover the full scope of our monitoring activities and are occurring at such a speed that it's sometimes difficult for us to keep up. Fortunately, these reforms are being carried out hand in hand with the Council of Europe bodies. Since 2022 report, the Venice Commission has released 5 advisory opinions. GRECO has adopted a 4th report of the prevention of corruption in respect of members of parliament, judges and prosecutors, as well as an initial evaluation report on preventing corruption in central governments and law enforcement agencies. ECRI has released its 6th monitoring cycle report on Armenia. To help implement all these recommendations, the Action Plan for Armenia 2023 to 2026 was officially launched. Armenia is reforming itself rapidly, and the Council of Europe is by its side. Armenia's Velvet Revolution in 2018 called for the end of corruption, genuine democracy, and respect for the rule of law and human rights. The Armenians called for the very values that founded our organization. Such peaceful democratic revolutions are not a good example for the autocrats in neighboring countries, and it is obvious that some will do everything to see Armenian democratic reforms fail. What is at stake Therefore, it's the persistence and resilience of these reforms. The deadliest threat to Armenian democracy might not come from abroad, but from within. It is necessary to build a system with working, independent bodies that will operate as depoliticized checks and balances. Too often, partisan politics is the lens through which every decision is interpreted. Whether it be a court decision, an administrative sanction, or an appointment. Armenia has, in a few years, won the confidence of its citizens in elections. The same must be done with independent media, the courts and judges, and anti-corruption bodies. Armenia is on the right path, and as long as it follows it, I hope it will find all the support it needs from our Assembly. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you, Mrs. Sarok. In the debate, I call first the speakers on behalf of political groups. First is the Mr. Claude Kern on behalf of ALDE. The floor is yours.
Merci, Madame la Présidente, mes chers collègues.
Thank you, Madam President. Colleagues, I would like to start by thanking our colleagues Kimmo Kiljunen and Boriana Abek for their report. Their conclusions are, generally speaking, positive regarding Armenia. I very much welcome, of course, this report, since the country has gone through a very difficult time in recent years. More recently, the loss of Nagorno-Karabakh, which means that practically all its inhabitants have had to flee to Armenia as refugees. More than 100 people were welcomed in Armenia in just a few days. The Armenian authorities did their best to manage this emergency situation. We should welcome that, because that's a mark of respect for these refugees. I would like to reiterate the firm condemnation expressed by the French Parliament regarding the military offensive carried out by Azerbaijan and the forced exodus, which is like a process of ethnic cleansing. The growing threat of destabilization of Armenia carried out by Russia as a result of the overtures from this country to the European Union, as well as hegemonic ambitions by Azerbaijan, represent a danger for the Republic of Armenia, its territorial integrity and peace in the Caucasus. We can but hope for the conclusion of a peace agreement and a peace and stable, just and stable peace between the two countries. In this very troubled context, efforts made by Armenia in recent years are something which I think we should very much welcome. In January 22, we stressed that Armenia had made real progress when it comes to democratic development. The Monitoring Committee is now underlining the important work which has been done since the Velvet Revolution to strengthen trust in the electoral process. This is indispensable and was done well. Positive reforms have also been carried out in the field of the police, setting up a neighbourhood police force so as to, at the same time, enforcing the independence of the judicial system and to fight against corruption. Although some reforms will, of course, take time to achieve their full results, the current trends are satisfactory. The main remaining difficulty is political in nature. Efforts to enhance the integrity of the electoral process have not yet led to a regain in trust between the political parties in Parliament. The lack of cooperation between the majority and the opposition in the Parliament, serving the democratic system in the country, remains something which should be carefully monitored. So I would call on all our colleagues from the different parties, in the name of the national interest, to find a quick solution so as to ensure the opposition can fully play its role in Parliament. On behalf of the ALDE group, I would call on all members to vote for this text proposed by our colleagues.
Mr. George Lukaides, the floor is yours. He's absent, so he's not here, and I proceed with Monsieur Piero Fassino, Socialist Party. La parole est à vous.
You have the floor.
Grazie.
Thank you, Madam President. We're talking about a country that has had a dreadful history. And since the collapse of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union has suffered 3 wars and the tragedy of Nagorno-Karabakh. And therefore, I think that the first thing that this Council should underline is the preservation of the independence and sovereignty of the country. And this shouldn't go without saying, because very often in the course of history, Armenian identity has been contested, and even the right of Armenia to exist. But we must maintain and keep and preserve the identity and cultural and religious identity of this people, its sovereignty and its integrity, bearing in mind that the history of Armenia is part of the story of human civilization. I agree with the report, and I will call upon you to vote in favour of it. I think the risks which Armenia is running, despite the positive political developments of recent times, is running. There is a very polarized internal domestic political situation, which too often leads to clashes between the government and majority party and the opposition parties. And this leads to an over-dramatization of conflicts and a destabilization of the domestic political situation. This is the result of political crises which have happened repeatedly, with changes of majority and with presidents being removed and prime ministers being removed. And also there was an attempt to undermine the role of President Pashinyan after the Nagorno-Karabakh events, but he has been a focus of stability in the politics of the country. We must therefore call upon the political forces in Armenia to set aside this polarization and their ongoing conflictual approach. And we must encourage them to move forward in the processes which have already been launched when it comes to the judiciary, to preserve the freedom of information and the media, countering corruption. And these are significant advances. And here, Armenia has shown that it is determined to implement the opinions of the Venice Commission and of this Assembly. In conclusion, we must express strong support for the consolidation of democracy in Armenia, and we must continue to support Armenia as a sovereign and independent country, and we must support a rapid settlement of relations with Azerbaijan and to bring about a safe peace for Armenia and for stability for the entire region. Thank you.
Speaker is Mr. Lukaides. The floor is yours. Microphone, please.
Our co-rapporteurs for this excellent report. I believe that Armenia will be able to move to the next stage of post-monitoring procedure, provided, of course, that it continues with the same engagement and determination on its ambitious reform program. Armenia, dear colleagues, has achieved much progress in our key areas of concern, despite a particularly hostile international environment since 2022. The reforms pursued have addressed all concerns identified by the monitoring procedure and are based on an intense and fruitful cooperation with the Council of Europe, including the Venice Commission. As mentioned in the report, Armenia has amended to a large extent its electoral code in line with international obligations and Council of Europe standards, as have proven the 3 previous electoral procedures. Further improvements in the electoral processes for reasons of consistency, stability and trust in public institutions are essential. This should be undertaken through a broad, comprehensive reform and the implementation of outstanding recommendations, particularly those regulating party financing and the administration of public resources. Noteworthy improvements have also been made with respect to the independence of the judiciary, the neutrality of the Supreme Judicial Council, and the need to free judges from intimidating disciplinary proceedings. The abolition of the criminalization of defamation is a welcome development, as is also the intention to pursue a comprehensive media reform to ensure diversity and plurality and effective freedom of expression. At the same time, more efforts must be made to improve the polarized political environment between the ruling majority and the opposition, especially as regards key appointments that should be reached on the basis of cross-party consensus. All voices need to be heard in a democracy. Respecting the legitimacy of political opponents will further anchor democracy and its institutions. Last but not least, dear colleagues, let us not forget the very challenging circumstances the Armenian authorities have had to deal with as a result of Azerbaijan's military operation in Nagorno-Karabakh last October. The ethnic cleansing perpetrated by Azerbaijan created a critical situation for the Armenian population of Nagorno-Karabakh, forcing more than 100,000 people to flee their ancestral homelands, thereby causing much economic and humanitarian hardship. The Armenian authorities have managed to swiftly respond to the massive influx of these vulnerable persons by providing adequate levels of protection, housing, income, and employment, and should be commended for these brave efforts. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Madame Oder, on behalf of EPP, la parole est à vous.
You have the floor, madam. Madam President, Armenia is on the right path, the path of democracy. Following efforts and reforms, Armenia has undeniably made huge progress. Nevertheless, it still has a long way to go. All the same, we must acknowledge that Armenia is the only real democracy in this region. Its situation is unenviable. It is surrounded by autocratic countries. Imagine if your neighbors are such as Russia, Azerbaijan, Georgia, Turkey, and Iran. This is no doubt why Armenia decided to become a candidate for admission to the European Union in the hope of finding a democratic ally. Azerbaijan's military offensive against Nagorno-Karabakh and the subsequent exodus of the Armenians from that country, almost all of them left and went to Armenia. This, of course, has placed Armenia in an even more difficult situation, both externally and internally. I was member of a recent parliamentary delegation to Armenia, and we saw the Azerbaijani military positions above the Armenian villages on the newly demarcated borders which have been imposed, and we heard shots fired from these military camps. In Armenia, the people from Nagorno-Karabakh who have gone there need to be housed, they need to find employment, and this adds to existing problems. This is why it's particularly important to encourage Armenia to pursue its efforts along this path, and we must recognize the progress that has been achieved. Nevertheless, Armenia cannot afford to stop, and we encourage Armenia to continue its reform process in order to stabilize and ensure the proper rooting of a democratic system, and particularly to persevere in reinforcing the independence of its judiciary, freedom of information, electoral law, and reinforcing democratic institutions, and in its determination to counter corruption. But above all, we must note efforts that have already been made in this area, and also when it comes to gender equality, countering domestic violence, and ensuring an inclusive society. This excellent report by our two co-rapporteurs, whom I would like warmly to thank, describes the situation very well. A lot still needs to be done, but a lot has already been done already. it will be important to support and accompany Armenia on its path of democracy and reforms. And this Council has the right instruments to provide this support. Thank you.
Merci. On behalf of European Conservatives, Mr. Armen Gevorgian, the floor is yours.
There are three criteria, in my view, for evaluating monitoring reports: objectivity, relevance, and utility. From the objectivity standpoint, I have to say that the documents submitted to this debate do not reflect the real situation with human rights and democracy in Armenia. Since the resolution 2427 and in the documents tabled today, there is a fundamental flaw and misunderstanding about the nature of the current situation in my country. To put it more clearly, the institutions that enable political process and constructive dialogue, those that protect and ensure political minority rights and political freedoms in general, such as parliamentary oversight mechanism, ombudsperson office, independent judiciary, have all been put under control of the executive office and have become dysfunctional. Not only the opposition, but also many reputable international human rights organizations have noted such challenges. The main problem for countries like Armenia is not and has not been the denial of the right to citizens to vote or participate in political process. It is the indefinite grace period that international organizations have granted the incumbent government, which has been using it to build a maximum possible centralized system of administration. From the relevance standpoint, intensive domestic political processes have been going on in the country for more than 2 months, and it is quite strange that there is no mention of this in the report. The events of June 12, 2 weeks ago, have become the absolute new law of evolving anti-democratic trends in Armenia. The police used indiscriminate force and special means against peaceful demonstrators in downtown Yerevan, causing injury to more than 100 people. Dozens of participants in peaceful protests have been arrested and prosecuted, but not a single law enforcement official has been punished. And finally, about the utility. Such resolutions as those tabled today not only do not allow to consolidate democracy, but also, worst of all, provide indulgence for all future governments to safely disregard the agenda of human rights and rule of law. Such disregard to what is happening on the ground eventually encourages people and politicians to take the political process to the streets. Madam President, today Armenia is essentially facing the historical need to find a new alternative to its recent difficult past and truly tragic present. The Council of Europe can either help the country find this alternative and as a result the future, or leave the Armenian society democratically underdeveloped. Hence, the entire logic of the documents prepared by co-reporters requires significant revision to serve the purpose of enabling democracy and human rights. Thank you.
Thank you. In the debate, I call next Mr. Ruben Rubinian, EPP. 3 minutes, please.
Thank you. Dear colleagues, first I want to thank our co-rapporteurs for the excellent report, which showcases the impressive progress that Armenia has made since the Velvet Revolution of 2018. But it has to be mentioned that ever since the Velvet Revolution happened, and after 2 years of stability and reforms, in Armenia we have seen one global pandemic, one 44-day bloody war during a global pandemic, numerous attempts of violent change of the government, a coup d'etat attempt by the military, 2 later major attacks on the sovereign territory of Armenia by Azerbaijan and occupation of part of Armenian territory, an ethnic cleansing in Nagorno-Karabakh, which resulted in more than 100,000 people leaving Nagorno-Karabakh, being forcibly displaced from Nagorno-Karabakh and coming to Armenia, later attempts of violent change of government again. But nevertheless, During all these times and during all these processes, Armenia managed to substantially and consistently improve its standing on international rankings on fight against corruption, media freedom. It has conducted reforms on judiciary, electoral code, etc. Even economically, we have managed to have one of the highest GDP growths in our region. Dear colleagues, anti-democratic forces inside Armenia and outside it will try to create a narrative according to which the reason for these challenges is democracy itself. They will try to convince the people of Armenia, and not only of Armenia, of the people of the region, that democracy brings to chaos and instability. But we beg to differ. We think that the very reason that Armenia and its democratic institutions managed to withstand these enormous challenges is democracy itself. Democracy is the reason that Armenia managed to preserve its sovereignty and is continuing to strengthen its sovereignty. And of course, we are determined to continue our democratic path, but we need also your support, because this is not only Armenia's struggle for democracy, this is also the struggle of democracy itself. And I know, and we know that Armenia is not situated in the most calm regions of all, and Armenia is not living the easiest of times, but it may be said, and it should be said, that the democratic transition of Armenia is a beam of hope, a beacon of light in these dark times for our continent, and we count on you in this process. Thank you.
Thank you. The next speaker is Ms. Gazarian, ALDE.
Honorable Chair, dear colleagues, dear reporter, Armenia has a strong reform agenda, and this is clearly reflected in the reform. Regardless of the difficulties Armenia underwent and is still undergoing, it is clear that the people of Armenia made a choice. We want to be a democratic state. We need to protect our democracy, and this needs everyday protection and strong devotion. Hence, it is important to state that electoral reforms were conducted properly to safeguard democracy. The monitoring committee welcomed the reforms of electoral legislation, which were thoroughly discussed with different stakeholders in different regions of Armenia. It is mentioned that in the report that in 2013 we held third elections that were after 2018 elections and 2021 snap elections, which have been assessed as by the international community as being free of irregularities, and unlike the elections we have before the Velvet Revolution. This is important to stress. As my colleagues have already mentioned, different reforms conducted by my government, let's say judicial reforms, the fight, anti-corruption fight, I would like to bring your attention to the reforms conducted by me and my colleagues from the ruling party, the combat against domestic violence. In September 2024, the National Assembly adopted amendments to the existing bill on preventing domestic violence, which increased the effectiveness of protection of the victims of domestic violence. The purpose of the amendments were to bring two new terms, partner, and to criminalize stalking as offered by the Istanbul Convention. Under the bill, the aggravating factors listed in the number of articles of criminal code were renewed. Factors such as by gender or conducted by the partner or ex-partner. In this regard, I would like to bring your attention to the fact that Armenia did ratify Rome Statute. November 3rd, we ratified in the parliament Rome Statute, and I completely agree with the Prime Minister that we were looking at the ratification of a Rome Statute as another measure which will enable the Republic of Armenia to use the capabilities of the International Criminal Court in ensuring external security. I would like to reaffirm once more that Armenia stays committed to the negotiations of peace treaty. Thank you.
Thank you. Our last speaker is Ms. Yulka Khan, EPP. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Madam President. Honorable colleagues, today I am honored to speak to you about the significant democratic reforms that have taken place in Armenia since the 2018 revolution. The Velvet Revolution marked a pivotal moment in our nation's history, ushering an era of hope, change, and democratic renewal. The Velvet Revolution was a moment when Armenians came together to demand change, calling for an end to corruption and authoritarianism. This revolution was not just about changing leaders. It was about fundamentally transforming the political landscape of Armenia. Since the revolution, Armenia has embarked on a path of comprehensive democratic reforms aimed at strengthening its democratic institutions, enhancing transparency, and promoting the rule of law. One of the most significant post-revolution achievements has been the overhaul of the electoral system. Efforts were made by the government of Armenia to ensure that elections were free, fair, and transparent. The electoral code, as well as the law on political parties, were amended significantly in compliance with many recommendations of the Venice Commission, as well as the ones of the OSCE ODIHR. Strengthening the independence of the judiciary has been a cornerstone of Armenia's democratic reforms. Steps such as integrity check of the candidates for judges, prosecutors, investigators have been taken to ensure that those appointed are merit-based and are free from political influence. A special focus has been placed on combating corruption. Ambitious reforms within the police, the establishment of anti-corruption bodies, and the implementation of stringent measures against corrupt practices have helped to prevent and counteract corruption, creating a more transparent and accountable judiciary and law enforcement bodies. There has been a significant push towards ensuring media freedom as well. Efforts have been made to promote independent journalism. As a result, Armenia is the 43rd among 180 countries in the Media Freedom Index as of 2024, improving its ranking every consecutive year. Dear colleagues, war is the worst enemy of democracy. However, this challenge has not prevented the Armenian government to continue its democratic reforms in parallel with the security-related issues. After a 44-day war in Nagorno-Karabakh in 2020, after the further attacks on the sovereign territory of Armenia, there was a debate among the Armenian society that democracy and security exclude each other, and it's not possible to be a strong country while being democratic. Despite all security-related difficulties, the answer of the Armenian people to this debate was precise. Democracy and security do not contradict, but rather complement each other. Democracy is the conscious choice of the people of Armenia, and it stands strong for protecting Armenia's democracy. Dear colleagues, while significant progress has been made, the journey of democratic reforms is ongoing. The foundations have been laid, but it's up to us to build upon them. The success of these reforms depends on the political will of the Armenian government. We must remain committed to the principles of democracy, ensuring that our institutions are resilient and responsive to the needs of all citizens. Democratic reforms carried out in Armenia since the 2018 revolution have set our nation on a path towards a brighter, more democratic future, and the Armenian government will do its best to uphold our democratic values and build a society where freedom, justice, and equality reign supreme. Thank you.
Thank you. I must now interrupt the list of speakers. The speeches of members on the speakers list who have been present during the debate but have not been able to speak may be given to the table office for publication in the official report. I remind colleagues that the typewritten text can be submitted electronically if possible, no later than 4 hours after the list of speakers is interrupted. In a moment, I shall call Ms. Eberg, rapporteur, to reply. You have 3 minutes in total.
Thank you, Madam President, and thank you, dear colleagues, for participating in this important debate. Here in the Council of Europe, we work for promoting democracy, rule of law, and human rights, and Armenia is a bright example how a country, a former Soviet country, can transform to a democracy. And it's quite difficult in the surroundings of Armenia. Only with autocracy, Russia and Iran and Turkey and Azerbaijan, despite these very, very difficult conditions, Armenia has reached a lot of achievements in a path of democracy. And it's not only a progress for Armenia, it's progress for our assembly too, because in its path for democracy, Armenia always have asked the opinion of Council of Europe, the opinion of Venice Commission, of ECRI, of Greco. So Armenia has a lot to be proud about, but we also can be very proud of Armenian development. Many of you mentioned the relation between majority and the opposition, and we agree that this relation is a problem. And our report is calling for radical change of the political culture. The government has a two-thirds majority in parliament and can decide alone. Although this is perfectly legal, it's not satisfactory and does not allow for consensus-building efforts. The opposition has been calling for boycotts, is threatening of mass resignation from parliament, and it's calling in harsh terms for the impeachment of the prime minister. All stakeholders should accept the legitimacy of one another and try to enter in good faith in negotiations. The Venice Commission has released a checklist on relations between majority and opposition, and we encourage, especially Mr. Gevorgyan, to take a look at this recommendation. I have not time enough to comment the criticism for not being objective in this report, but I think when we was listening to the other speakers, it was no one who doubted in the objectivity of our report. Finally, I'd like to thank the Armenian delegation, the authorities who were very, very helpful during our visit, and especially the Secretariat and Mathieu Monen for his help. Thank you.
Thank you. Does the chairperson of the committee wish to speak? Yes, please.
So, thank you, President, and dear colleagues. Indeed, it is a pleasure to present you the results of the Monitoring Committee's work regarding Armenia. Armenia is engaged in a very ambitious reform program and is leading it in commendable cooperation with the Council of Europe monitoring bodies. Pace of democratic reform is impressive. Since our last resolution in January 2022, Armenia has abolished the criminalization of defamation. It has ratified Protocol number 13 to the Convention of the Protection of Human Rights and Fundamental Freedoms concerning the abolition of death penalty in all circumstances, and it has become a party to the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. In the field of election law, after 3 important elections held without major contestation, the committee concluded that the objective to hold genuinely democratic elections had, to a large extent, been achieved. In the field of the fight against corruption, progress has been real over the last years, and the will of authorities can be seen, but much still needs to be done. The independence of the judiciary has to be settled to gain the confidence of the population. Reforms in this field are undertaken in full cooperation with the Venice Commission, and they are expected to give good results in the coming months. But policies change people's lives only if they last over time. Concern remains over the sustainability of the reforms. The foreign policy and geopolitical context can be a destabilizing factor. As Armenia is shifting towards European integration, destabilization from abroad is a very actual threat. Dealing with the arrival of more than 100,000 refugees from Karabakh less than a year ago is an enormous challenge, as it would be in any of our democracies. Helping Armenia meeting the long-term needs of its population is critical for the stability of the country and the strengthening of its institutions, so we European countries can make a difference here. In the country itself, the lack of political dialogue between majority and opposition, the extreme polarization of the political faction, and the widespread use of hate speech risk undermining the institutions. Consensus should be found, at least for defense of democratic institutions. Dear colleagues, Armenia has made impressive advances and important advances, and it is all the more crucial to protect these. For the future, the Monitoring Committee shall pay particular importance to the implementation of reforms regarding the justice system, the field of media, and freedom of expression. And to conclude, I would like to join in thanking both rapporteurs for their extensive work, as well as our colleagues from the Secretariat of the Monitoring Committee for the substantial investment in preparation of this report. Thank you.
Thank you. The Committee on the Honoring of Obligation and Commitments by Member States of the Council of Europe has presented a draft resolution to which 2 amendments have been tabled. They will be taken in the order in which they appear in the compendium. I remind you that speeches on amendments are limited to 30 seconds. Any amendment which has been unanimously approved by the committee size for report shall not be put to the vote in plenary and shall be declared as definitively approved unless 10 or more members of the Assembly object. I understand that the chairperson of Committee of the Honoring of Obligation and Commitments by Member State of the Council of Europe wishes to propose to the Assembly that amendments 1 and 2 to the draft resolution, which were unanimously approved by the committee, should be declared as approved. Is that so, Ms. Anna Kalina Lukashevitsa? Thank you. If no objection, I will consider the amendments to be approved. Is there any objection? If there is, we will need to verify that the objection has the required support of 10 people. Please, could those who object raise their hands? There is no rejection, and amendments 1 and 2 to the draft resolution are therefore approved and will not be called.
67.
I have received an oral amendment from Ms. Boriana Aberg, which reads as follows. Paragraph 20, replace the words prosecutor's office with relevant authorities. The President may accept an oral amendment on the grounds of promoting clarity, accuracy, or conciliation, and if there is no opposition from 10 or more members to it being debated. In my opinion, the oral amendment meets the criteria of Rule 34(7)(a). Is there any opposition to the amendment being debated? That is not the case. I therefore call Ms. Boriana Aberg to support the oral amendment. You have 30 seconds.
Thank you, Madam President. Since the decriminalization of defamation, the prosecutor office is not longer in charge of the implementation of the legislation. Insult and defamation is the reason why we suggest that the prosecutor office should be replaced with the words by relevant authorities. It's just a factual clarification, Madam President.
Thank you. Does anyone wish to speak against the oral amendment? No one? So the committee is obviously in favor. I shall now put the oral amendment to the vote. The vote is open. The vote is closed, and I call for the result to be displayed. The oral amendment is agreed. We will now proceed to vote on the draft resolution contained in document 15994. A simple majority is required. The vote is open. The vote is closed, and I call for the result to be displayed. The draft resolution in document 15994 is adopted. The Assembly will hold its next public sitting tomorrow at 10 a.m. with the agenda approved on Monday. So our work for today is now finished. I wish you a pleasant rest of the evening. Thank you.